particular civilization to disappear. The whole lecture series is called The Lost Civilizations, and the Goths just disappeared, probably because they were overrun by other people. No real mechanism that came from within the culture.
Yeah.
Who disappeared?
The Goths.
The
Goths, the Goths. You know, like the Visigoths.
Okay. Yeah, you have to be careful with those names, actually. Sorry to say, but Goth simply means German.
It can.
Yes, originally they were Germanic tribes. And this guy was a professor from London, so he really explained it all very well. So I got it, Stephen.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of those civilization actually disappeared. They just became merged into some other thing, you know.
Well, the term, the Germanics was a term that the Gauls gave them. It was learned in Caesar's time, but weirdly, it was in the later part of the empire, from the eastern part of the empire, when they began inquiring with some of these people, or what do you call yourselves? And he said, well, we're called Goths.
Right.
And he said, but that's not my tribal name. He's talking to some joker in the Crimea, of all places. And they worked out that that was a generalized name for anybody who had Odin or the equivalent to Thor as their god. And the Eastern Empire began using this term. And the papacy, because it was so under the thumb of the Eastern Empire until Charlemagne showed up, learns this term from the Eastern court.
Right.
Oh.
And they began applying it generally to any Germanic near them. So they said, oh, there's Goths to the east of us and there's Goths to the west of this. These Goths never called themselves Goths. And the one Goth said that this was a term that describes all of us, not just some particular group. And it seems to come from their word for their priests, the Gothi, who worshipped Odin. So that was what they figured out. All these groups that called themselves Germans. That's what we've got in common, because we have the same name for the God speaker or the gods, for the sacred, the Goths.
Yes.
And now it's unusable because it's been applied to smutty people who dress in dark clothing all over the place.
You know, Stephen, he did talk about that. And he also mentioned a very interesting point, because one of the participants asked this question: if anybody has done any DNA evidence, having a DNA evidence to trace the original Goths? And the answer was no, right? So the origin of the Goths, he says, they migrate from Skansa, which is north of the Baltic, which they thought it was probably near Scandinavia. And they were, you're right, they are Germanic tribes, and there was a question as to whether or not they had Scandinavian origin.
So on that note, why don't we...
as Doc Holliday says in the movie, that's a rumor.
That's correct.
Let's dive in for this week. So I'm excited about David Roel and the scanning efforts and OCR that he's been doing to get the website put together. Another piece of news you guys probably want about Millennia and Microcosm. I talked to Kenneth Smith this weekend and Saturday, in fact, and he confirmed that David's had a theory for a while that 3 chapters that we've been bundling at the end of Millennia and Microcosm don't belong there. It's 3 chapters called, now why am I drawing a blank? Something of omnipossibility. Do you remember, David, what's the
horrific intoxicant?
The horrific intoxicant of omnipossibility.
Wow.
And we'd been for a while sort of thinking that those sort of caboosed onto the end of Millennia and Microcosm, but David read them and said, I don't think these belong here. And I ran that by Kenneth and he agreed. That was just a three installment series that happened to come right on the heels, but isn't actually related. And part of what that means for us is then Millennia and Microcosm doesn't have a conclusion yet. And Kenneth confirmed that it does not, in fact, have a conclusion yet. So I ran by him an idea that David and I had tried out, which is, what if we went back to mythos? What if we picked some stories and ran them through the three filters? How would an ancient interpret it? How would a medieval interpret it? How would a modern interpret it? And close out that way with a series of, kind of like maybe Oedipus, right? Or The Grasshopper and the Ants is one that Kenneth had written, and we looked at and thought this would go really well in a concluding section that shows how each of the different symbol systems looks at each of these stories, how they interpret the world differently, to help make it concrete and bring it home with examples that we can understand. Maybe Midas, for example. And he said yes, he agrees. Let's do that. So we're gonna be working on the conclusion to Millennia and Microcosm while we're going through it, and hopefully we'll get those concluding chapters in place in time for when we get there. So that's something we're going to be working on to wrap up the series at the end. But I like the way that it comes full circle back to the mythos and logos discussion we had last year. And, sort of, right? It kind of weaves a little hole. I also like the idea of, rather than talking about the lens systems of the different epoch, actually using them as an exercise and seeing, well, how do they look differently at the same story? And it might be nice if the very last chapter was a set of suggestions for the reader. It's like, if you have mastered these three lens systems, how about you take a try at writing, how would a ancient interpret this story? How would a medieval interpret this story? How would a modern interpret it? And as a way to exercise it, leave it open-ended.
I like that.
Same. I like that as well.
Because I have very strong opinions about this.
Nice. So, we'll be, one of the things we'll be wanting to do as we go along is collecting what we think of are particularly choice examples that would make good conclusions for the reader to try out in different ways. But for now, we'll dive back in where we left off. Last time, so for those who are just joining us, this is a seminar series about the philosophy of Kenneth Smith, and it's going through his column in the Comics Journal from around the year 2000. It was called End Times, that's being collected into a book called Millennia and Microcosm. And this is a project in which he is teaching the idea that these different epochs saw the world differently from one another, that we aren't all just variations on the same thing, but that we actually have orthogonal perspectives on the world. And that with that in mind, part of what we're trying to learn is, how did each of these epochs look at the world differently from the other two epochs? And part of the exercise of doing that is to learn to liberate ourselves from being trapped inside the perspective of our own epoch, trying to learn how to modulate between different perspectives. Because once we can do that, then ostensibly we could try out other philosophies with an open mind, instead of always just trying to pigeonhole them into what modernism thinks about them. With that in mind, we're in chapter 4, called Ancient Civilization. And in one chapter, he's attempting to go through all of the core principles that informed the way that ancients see the world. And specifically, the way they see the world differently than the way we see the world, and differently than the way a medieval sees the world.
Okay,
what are the
we were in B, were we?
Yes. So last week, week before last, when we last did one of these installments, we finished A. And now we are going into section B within chapter 4. Section A, for those who weren't here, it was nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. And it was the way that the ancients understood the natural world as a source of authority and a model for all other things, for understanding the world, for understanding culture, for understanding history, for understanding personality, you name it. They modeled it in terms of nature. Even their gods didn't exist before nature. They didn't create nature. They were created by nature and were part of it and represented aspects of it. And so with that in mind, now we're ready for part B. Part B is where we turn to how the ancients see human beings, how they see human beings. And so we're going to look at this both at the level of a culture or society on the one hand, but also at the level of an individual. And what we're going to see when we read this, especially the way that we do it, where we read it carefully, trying to tease out the significance, we're going to see that the way that they saw human beings and culture was not just a little different, but radically different from the way we see it. That
I have to say, reading this B is sort of full of a lot of stuff that's come to my mind in the last few years.
Yes.
I'm seeing a reciprocity here. It's more sophisticated than my outlook here, but similar.
Yeah. It's the important thing to stress for the folks who are new is that Kenneth, following the Hegelian model but expanding on it, argues that the ancients are not a primitive version of moderns. Modernism believes everybody who preceded modernity is just a primitive version of themselves. Either they're a mistake or they're unfinished, and that we're the culmination of history. And it's very hard for us to look at these other lens systems for understanding the world as anything other than a crude primitive version of ourselves. But he's going to make the argument very strongly in chapter 4 that that is not how the Greeks certainly did not imagine that they were a primitive version of us, because we didn't exist, but also that there's a point to their argument. As we look at the way they see the world, we discover that there are things they understand better than we do. Just
this is Hegel's end of times point, where
Yes.
we've finally crawled up on the rock and we can see clearly now the rain has gone.
Yes.
We are the ones.
This is the modernist orthodoxy, right? We're the first, most objectivist, most scientific people of all time. We're the only ones who care about the truth.
And all I see are mad apes.
What we're going to discover in chapter 4 is that what we see is the truth as we understand it, not as it actually is. And that the Greeks understand it differently than we do. And we each have something to learn from the other if we but try. And the place where this is going to get the most uncomfortable is in section B, because section B is going to confront our core ideologies about what it means to be human and what it means to be a society. And moderns have an enormous amount of egotism about themselves, both individually and socially. And chapter B is basically going to sweep the feet out from under us and confront it directly. And it's not going to do it by Kenneth saying that we're dumb. It's going to do it by showing how the Greeks saw the world. And the more you see how the Greeks see the world, the more uncomfortable it makes us about ourselves from that lens system. So let's go ahead and dive in. I put a link in the chat. I'm going to post it again for the folks who just joined us in the last few minutes, so everybody can get there. There's N04. You're looking for section B in chapter 4. So let's go right to the text. I guess we have a hand first. So Phil, go ahead. Got to come off mute though.
Wait, I have a question. I'm scared that the link will give me a virus.
The link will not give you a virus.
Okay.
Yeah, David Royal built this website, so it's all clean.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I'm responding to actually the question you said when you said, well, the Greeks couldn't possibly imagine themselves as a primitive version of ourselves because we didn't exist at that time.
Yes.
Let's imagine that we did exist, okay, at that time. Would they imagine us then as a decadent version of themselves rather than that they were the primitive version of us? That's question number one. If that indeed is the case, then I would imagine that they would think that the classical period was already a decadent version of themselves, right?
Yes.
So in some sense, they saw it like transforming into a very early form of modernism, if you want to call it that way. So in some sense, they already did see us in a funny way. Could you say something about that? Because that
Sure.
seems like an interesting question.
You got it. So, of course, you go right to the provocative question. And everything I say about this is going to make more sense after we go through section B. But let's go ahead and give it a little coverage now anyway. The Greeks, the Greek philosophers writing in the period during which we have preserved most of their writings, the Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle era of philosophy and what followed. You're right, they did consider themselves to be on the downslope. They looked at the Peloponnesian War and they saw a disaster. And they saw, this is for the folks who haven't been here in past weeks to hear me say this, they didn't just see a disaster, they saw the one disaster that more than anything else they knew about, and they did everything in their power to construct their societies to never let that disaster happen. Because for them, it was a replay of the Trojan War, in which the great heroes of the past destroyed their own civilization through folly and foolishness. And the classical Greeks did everything in their power to keep from doing that again, because they spent 900 years clawing their way up from a dark age, rediscovering literacy and art and putting themselves back together into something more than just a bunch of feuding tribes. And they were determined to use every power at their disposal. I mean, politics, economics, social relations, religion, art, literature, everything that they had was pointed in the direction of trying to ensure that they didn't repeat the Trojan War. So when the Peloponnesian War broke out, it's difficult for a modern to fully appreciate the scale of dismay that the Greeks felt, which was like, of all, we only had one job, one job to not do what we're doing right now, and we screwed it up. So they certainly saw that period as a decadent period, deeply frustrating and demoralizing. And some of the reasons why echo, you're right, Phil, echo some of the qualities that define modernism, but in such a smaller way than the way we do it, that I don't think they could have imagined us. And if they were confronted with us, they probably would have just concluded we were barbarians. Not just because we don't speak the Greek language and we got all this in our words, as speakers of other languages like to say about English, but because the way we use language and the way we relate to each other and organize ourselves doesn't follow any of their core principles. You know, what we call democracy is, of the two forms of democracy that Aristotle described, it's the bad one that nobody should ever do. That's the one that we do, right? And the same is true of aristocracy, tyranny versus, aristocracy, or aristocracy versus oligarchy. You had three different forms of government, each of which has a good form and a bad form. And in each case, whenever a modern does it, it does the bad form, according to Aristotle. And he would just be, and others who followed his writings would just be flabbergasted at the fact that not only do we do those things, but we turn them all up to 11 and pride ourselves on them. They would find us just inexplicable. We've talked before about how one of the core defining characteristics of modernity is our adherence to noesis, the intellectual rationalizing, formalizing part of our mind. And the Greeks didn't fully understand the perils and pitfalls of noesis. It had never been allowed to fully dominate in a way that they could pick it out and say, oh my goodness, that needs to be stopped. They didn't fully understand Banausoi. We've talked about the way that the medieval epoch perfected Banausoi by creating a two-tier society in which there were a tier of schemers and systematizers and manipulators atop a large population of relatively ignorant, very experiential human beings. And that's what kicked off in the Reformation, the launch of modernity, is that perfected, purified, mature, noesis then became the basis for our entire civilization worldwide going forward. The Greeks had never seen anything like that. None of the ancients had. So whenever they tried to understand noesis and the kinds of character types that come from it and the kinds of cultures, they could only do so haltingly and obliquely. So as a result, even though we might look back and see the noetic excessiveness of the sophists and others as being a core contributor to the collapse of ancient civilization, to the ancients, they saw it happening but had trouble characterizing what was happening to them. Like they went after the sophists. I mean, training the sophists was one of the accusations against Socrates that was at his trial. They knew there was a problem with sophistry. They could see that it was unprincipled, but they thought it was just like some kind of anomaly or aberration. They didn't understand it as a core potential liability of the human species. They didn't know how central it was to us as a possibility. And that's why they weren't prepared for it. That's why they didn't have the systems in place to recognize it, respond to it, and keep it from metastasizing, because they didn't know what was happening. We, on the other hand, as in the late stage modern epoch, we are well acquainted with noesis. It's the water we swim in and the air we breathe. This is one of the cases where we would have something to teach the Greeks about what went wrong with them, just like they would have something to teach us about what's going wrong with us. It's I think interesting that when you look at the relationships between the Greeks and modernist philosophers like Hegel, you can see Hegel recognizing the value of Heraclitus and saying, now here's a guy whose every single proposition I want to make core to my philosophy, which Hegel said, right, in the History of Philosophy. But he's doing it as a modern. So on the one hand, he's taking this potent stuff that's in Heraclitus, but then he's translating it into modernism. And thereby, not only does he add something and gain something through the systematization of Heraclitus's work, he also loses something on the gnostic side that Heraclitus had much more strongly than he did. And so we sort of see between the two, we see two sort of half perspectives on the world, that neither of which can fully understand what happened to it or to the other one. Stephen, got your hand up, go ahead, and then I'll go to the text.
Yeah, I was just going to say the closest I've just sort of generally come to Kenneth Smith's appreciation seems to come from the art historian, Sir Kenneth Clarke.
Yes.
He's the one that looks at the art and he says, this tells me about these people. I see that their creations which give me a clue as to what's going on in their mind. You know, you could stick a politician up in front of me and he'd say, oh, we're doing this and we're doing that. No, I'm not going to listen to that. I'm going to actually see what's going on when I look at their artworks, when I look at their architecture.
Right.
And he talks strongly, very strongly about the Renaissance and how that was the beginning of the new world as we know it today. The new outlook, the culture that arose above the former axial age.
Yes.
And he comes up very strongly in his episode on Martin Luther.
Mm-hmm.
He's pointing out the difference between the Italians and the Germans. And he said the Italians, you get, you know, all the wonderful Renaissance architecture, and they're quite complacent. They're very satisfied. This is it. But he said, you look at the artworks of the Germans, and you know, this who until then had been viewed by the Italians as just primitive barbarians, troublemakers. And he said, you look at all the paintings and the Germans are like this. What's the secrets of the universe? What's going on? This is at the Renaissance. The Germans are have an intense perspective.
Yeah.
I'll put up the other link to his one about Martin Luther. And this is the curious thing. Can you unpack what Martin Luther was? I mean, you look at Martin Luther from the outside, he's a crazy. He must have had clangers of steel to go and nail his whatever to the book on the front of the church against what was one of the most powerful organisations in the world. We assume he must have been crazy, but luck would have it, like a daring fighter pilot, he gets through.
Yes. And, you know, when we talked about Pico della Mirandola a few months ago, one of the things we talked about is the way that Martin Luther knew Pico's story inside and out. He knew what happened to Pico. So when he's nailing his theses to the church door, he has a keen understanding of how wrong it can go. So he's a fascinating character because he didn't think of himself as a modernizer. We see that in him looking backwards at him. But he saw himself as a medievalist who was trying to restore, you know, the authentic, uncorrupted church. He was like Pico. He was trying to preserve and protect the medieval order that he felt that the church had corrupted. He didn't fully grasp that the corrupt thing that he was fighting against was the medieval order, and that what he was doing was ushering in a new age. It's always the case that people can't quite see where they stand in history because they've been so saturated in the previous epoch that they use it to interpret what they're doing. It makes it hard for them to evaluate the consequences. All right, so let's go back to and thank you very much for bringing up Kenneth Clark and for sharing those links, Stephen. Kenneth, like you say, there are insights you can get about an epoch through experiencing it, whether through the art or the food or what have you, or through recreating through living history, that you could never get from just reading academic history or political speeches or what have you. There's always, at least in the epochs we know, a huge split between an age's claims about itself and what it's actually like to live in it. But let's go to the text. So how does he begin? In section B, let me see if I can drop a paragraph in here for us. So remember that this is coming right after the statement that to the Greeks, the utmost authority about truth is not logical argument. It's not systems. It's not people in power telling you what's true. It's not math. It's not science. It's nature. Nature is the ultimate authority about what's true and what's not. Kata phusei, according to nature, is how they say it must be true. It must be true because that's what we see in nature. That's what's actually there. And for them, they use that as frequently and as authoritatively as we use per se, or in its own right, or he auto, kata phusei. So that was literally the previous, that was the final words of the previous section as we go into this new paragraph. Having established that nature is the source of truth, you got to read this paragraph with that in mind. This is the way that the Greeks mean what Kenneth is describing here. He says, the Greeks realized that all people are liable to delude themselves into ethnocentrism, imagining their own invented and customary ways are the very ways of the world, right? So this is to be interpreted as they're liable by nature, by their nature. They're liable to delude themselves. And that when they imagine that their own invented and customary ways are the very ways of the world, what they're imagining is that their invented and customary ways have the authority of nature. that they have crowned themselves the real authority, and that nature isn't the real authority. There is a hidden sense of being a usurper in the way that ethnocentrism works. When people imagine this must be the right way because it's the way I do it, this must be the truth because this is what we believe, what they're doing, whether they recognize it or not, is claiming to be gods, claiming to have the authority of nature itself, to be in a position to make such proclamations. These proclamations lack humility. There is a native egotism to ethnocentrism. When you are a parochial person by nature, you are an ego monster, because to be parochial is to mistake your own experiences for the universal experience, and to mistake your limited mortal finite perspective on the real world for what's actually there in the real world. We believe that when we're ethnocentric, when we're parochial, we believe that the world can't be very complicated. If it was very complicated, then it wouldn't fit inside our finite life and our finite perspective. So it must be as simple as our thinking about it is. There's a reductionism that's built into ethnocentrism and this kind of delusion, and that all delusions, when we right, if I'll come to this in a second. When we see the word delude or delusion, we're talking about Kenneth's favorite quote, right, from Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard says, a delusion is a state of mind in which what you most need to think to get out of the delusion is precisely what you can't think. The delusion excludes self-criticism from the range of thought that it allows to ensure that you remain trapped within it. That's what makes it an ideology or a delusion. If it didn't do that, it would be something other than a delusion or an ideology. It's core to the definition that it's self-enclosing and repels alternative perspectives. A delusion is the state in which we trap ourselves into thinking that our perspective is the right perspective. And this is why he's got it here in this sentence. It goes hand in hand with ethnocentrism, parochialism, the native state that we're born into. When an infant is born, the infant doesn't even know that their parents are people. The concept that anybody else exists as a person doesn't exist yet. They have to learn that. They have to learn to recognize faces. They have to learn that the parents aren't always going to do what they want. Like even the most fundamental aspects of reality, like that I'm not all there is, that this isn't just a bunch of, all of this exists for no other reason than that I'm experiencing it, and the point is me, is something we have to grow out of. But the problem is it's hard to grow out of that because it's such an electric experience. It's a live wire experience. It sure feels like it's all about us, like we're the hero in our own story, and really there is only one story, and the story is us. And so as a result, it's the easiest thing in the world for a person or a culture to retreat back into that infantile perspective and say, I must have been right. This must all really be about me. Or if we've managed to graduate to the level of having an us, we graduate to the level of thinking it's all about us. We're number one. Right? This is the infantile action. And what he's doing here is he's linking together a bunch of ideas in this opening sentence to show that they depend on each other, that they directly inform each other, and that when we're talking about any of these things, we don't want to think about them as abstracted, separable little ideas. We want to think about them as this web of relationships that always comes along for the ride. Always. If we're talking about ethnocentrism or parochialism, if we're talking about the difference between nature's authority and a human authority, if we're talking, all of these things are being knitted together in this opening sentence to tie it into the previous section. So let's break here. Joseph and then Phil. Go ahead, Joseph.
Good to see everybody. This parochialism is actually, interesting because it kind of counters everything that the Greeks thought about with cosmopolitanism, in the sense that this is how you actually challenge you by getting out in the world and actually engaging with other cultures and other people, that you start to challenge the underlying assumptions that you actually have thought about the world.
That's right.
And it's really important because this is on a number of levels. This is like, we don't challenge our underlying principles for systems many times. So if we think about it in terms of even what our priorities are, what is true, like
Mhm.
this idea of like a monetary, policy or something along those lines, things like that will never challenge these underlying assumptions if we're kind of parochial and only think in one way.
Right.
And it's because it's interesting, because I thought about this a lot and over the past couple of weeks in particular, that you then are turned in on yourself and actually start to you kind of like implode. And that can happen as true for a person as it can for a country or a nation. So that's why it's this parochialism is so dangerous.
Yes.
And it is, but and is that a product of modernity?
No.
Okay.
No.
That's
He's saying that goes right back to the core of the way that our mind is structured. As a
okay.
species, Homo sapiens has these two basal faculties of the mind, and each of them is necessary but not sufficient. But when you wield one of them, it feels sufficient, and thereby it repels the other one. So as a tendency, as a result, Homo sapiens has a tendency to slip into half-witted modes in which we're not wielding both tools. It comes so easily to us. It's like falling down. Falling down is essential to being a bipedal species. I took a trip. People who've been on these calls before, probably heard me talk about the Navajo reservation. It was while hiking up some of the canyons with my Navajo friends that I discovered I had a thought for the first time that they introduced me to I'd never thought about before. And we were going up these incredibly steep slopes back and forth, climbing 1,000 feet, and it's sandstone and crumbly scree, and it makes you really nervous to go up. And he's telling us about how he's in his 60s at the time, 70s now. And he's telling us about how his dad used to go up here every day with their flock of sheep. And I'm looking at this going, how on earth? He says, oh, not just that. They'd take the cattle up here too. I'm looking at this going, how on earth do cattle or sheep get up these slopes when we can barely do it with our boots and our hiking poles and our technology and all our ingenuity? And he says, oh no, you've got that backwards. He says, it's easier for them than it is for us. They've got 4 legs. We've only got 2. If one of their legs slips, so what? They've got 3 others. But if one of our legs slips, we're down, right? He says, you have to really be around 4-legged animals through a variety of terrains before you are reminded that bipedalism, for all its advantages, is a fragile mode of locomotion. And we forget that and take it for granted. But falling down is part of being a 2-legged creature, right? And so in the same way, the structure of the Homo sapiens mind, thinking in terms of these two, self-repelling or alternately repelling modes of thought, falling into one or the other and thinking it's the whole thing, slipping into delusion is just like falling down. It's the easiest thing in the world for us to do. So now, what I think what Kenneth would say to underscore your question and make, put the extra spin on it is, we do have a third faculty of mind. And the third faculty of mind is there to help a culture correct itself against the previous 2 faculties of mind. What's specifically modern about the way we go about this is that we try to eliminate the third faculty and reduce everything down to the other 2. And that simplification thereby makes us more vulnerable to half-wittedness than any previous culture. Nobody ever tried to industrially exterminate an entire mode of thinking and character type the way we have in order to protect our vested interests and keep things stable. So, it's we're seeing behavior from us that other cultures couldn't ever get to because their Aristoi would eventually correct them. And we don't have any Aristoi, so there's nobody to correct us from the depths of our twin folly. So great question, Joseph. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been reading Heraclitus, through Heidegger.
Yeah.
That's coming up. And I read this thing about harvesting, which is sort of very, very interesting. it really helps in this context because his thing is on the one hand very difficult, but on the other hand very simple once you get it. He says, the notion of harvesting to us, and some of this I'm putting in, but basically he said, oh, you just go out there and collect the grain. What's the problem, right? You gather the grain, right? And so then he asked, like, well, what does gathering mean, right?
Yes.
And so he says, well, gathering means that there's an external part, but there's also an internal part. An internal part which has to do with mind, and the mind, in order to gather, must also gather itself first.
Yes.
I would call that consciousness, right? Gather itself first. And one of the things about consciousness is there is a region of openness to the open, what he calls it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you learn something and you say, aha, and you retain that understanding, but you also retain the openness to the open. And so that is the important part, rather than say, well, I got it, right? So the openness to the open means that there's always a question within the gathering itself. And that's what consciousness is about. You can't shut that down because that is the nature of the gathering that reflects the gathering of Earth. Earth also has to gather all these energies and stuff together in order to, in a sense, push it up into the world and penetrate into this thing.
Yeah.
And it's this sort of relationship between this gathering of, let's say, these things of being that being pushes out, or nature pushes out. And in some sense, the gathering of the mind, which is our phenomena, that allows us to, in a sense, understand the evolving nature of what the thing is. And so therefore, it's always somewhat transitory. And now, in some sense, like civilization, and this part I'm adding into it, but I'm interpreting it when he's talking about art, is that, yes, it's about what he calls the relationship between earth and world. The human beings create a world of beings, and earth somehow penetrates through that world in order to show itself in some sense. It is that mutual relationship that allows it to evolve. And so therefore, any institution you build up to create a world, then in a sense has to understand that it's transitory. And he goes one step further. He said, it's this in and out relationship between earth and world that allows what he's called basically living, which is breathing. As you breathe in, you breathe out, and you remain that relationship. And that's a relationship between a living thing and a dead thing, right? And so if you are a living thing, there's always this in and out, but the retaining, in a sense, the continuation of the in and out, and that reminded me quickly of Genesis, right? And God breathed life into Adam, right? And that's what turned him into something else. And so the central part, therefore, in the living is that there's always this relationship between the in and out and this openness to the open and the gathering thereby of the inner, let's say, world versus the outer earth,
That's
that
right.
relationship. I thought it was very, very descriptive of what the Greeks were trying to do.
Yeah,
And, it's like just wonderfully described. I mean, you have to bear down and go through it, but when he explains it, it's just like, oh, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great metaphor, and it goes to the heart of this idea of rupturing our tendency towards encapsulation by ensuring that we also reach out and inhale, what's actually going on before we attempt to legislate or what we think ought to be happening. It occurred to me that I should make a point. I don't know if I have before in the series, maybe once, that Kenneth Smith draws a very, very sharp distinction between his use of the word reality versus actuality. And so when you talked about humans generating a world, it's like he uses the word reality for that. We make our own realities out of our worldviews, out of our cultures. And we sort of, he describes it as in the same way that there are animals that will generate a cocoon or a web or something else. It's the way the human mind works that we generate a reality, and we act, we make our choices based on that reality instead of the actual world that we physically inhabit and where all the meaning and consequences come from. And thus we're constantly surprised when we take an action according to our reality and are surprised based on what nature has in mind for us in actuality. So anytime you see Kenneth use the words real or actual or reality or actuality, he's always using this dichotomy, which goes to what you were talking about. He's talking about that cultural envelope, and are we, when is it ruptured or and this goes back to what Joseph said, versus when do we slip into the habit of never reaching outside the envelope and always looking inward and becoming, kind of this, he uses the word a claustral envelope, the way we sort of insulate ourselves from the world. And he says that's one of the great hazards of modernity, is that our technological prowess has allowed us to keep people so separated from the basics of life that we give nature fewer and fewer opportunities to teach us where we're wrong about our worldview. Because, we may, plenty of people scoff at kids these days, don't understand milk comes from a cow. They think it comes from the store, but they're not wrong, because they have been pulled into an artificial world. Instead of mocking them, we should be looking at how and why we did that. And, are there things that we need to do to compensate for the artifice of people's lives to help plug them back into reality? But that wouldn't, it's easier to just point and laugh, right? Sharon, go ahead.
I think the last sentence of this paragraph
Yes.
Sums up human nature that we're talking about, the noesis. It says, this idiotism is human nature, a primal psychology. The reason humans are cultural creatures who are the captives of their own customs and words the world over. And I also think that in this discussion, we've brought up quite a few times about knowing thyself.
Yes.
Looking inside and knowing thyself. So I came across this quote from Soren Kierkegaard, which he says, a man may perform astonishing feats and comprehend a vast amount of knowledge, yet have no understanding of himself. But suffering directs a man to look within. If he succeeds, then and there within him is the beginning of this learning. But in my experience, I've seen moderns meet with adversarial circumstances, and it makes no difference.
Right.
So this just tells me that the primal psychology is very, very strong and really profound.
It is. It is. Yeah, that's a critical point. That Kierkegaard quote, that's got Heraclitus all over it. Kierkegaard knew his Heraclitus because he knew his Hegel, and he knew that Hegel was fond of Heraclitus. So he did his reading too. So, there's a Heraclitus quote that says, much learning does not teach wisdom, he says. And he lists a bunch of examples of highly educated Greeks who nevertheless were behaved like fools. And he talks about the way that it is so easy to advance in society without actually advancing in wisdom. It's a hazard for us. And as you say, in this quote, in this final sentence, there's something powerful at work. Now, our tendency is to just want to brush off every example of that and say, well, that person was just a dummy. Okay, that person was a fool. But when you keep seeing it everywhere, and especially when you get past that initial knee-jerk stage and you start seeing incredibly intelligent people, highly educated people you might think of as cosmopolitan, who still do it, it should be a warning that we're in the presence of something mighty. within us, something powerful and nearly universal. But the problem is, if you pull on that thread, it will unweave all of modernity. And we can only pull so far before we start to feel the uncomfortableness in our own garment. And so we then, veer off to a thought terminating cliche to shut off that line of investigation. We might found the Darwin Awards and celebrate people who did foolish things and got themselves killed. We might say, oh, it's that other political party, they're all the dummies, but we're not like that. We'll find some way to get a cliche to sever the line of investigation and keep ourselves from looking, because that is the basis of all of modernity. And if we fully appreciate this problem, it calls into question the reasonable man theory, a jury of your peers. It calls into question, enlightened self-interest, the basis of capitalism. It calls into question the Soviet 5-year plans. Almost everything, no matter which political party you look at, depends upon the idea that we do not have these deep, serious flaws in the way that we see the world, and these liabilities that come so easily to us. We don't know what a modern civilization would look like if it took into account and did justice to this core problem in Homo sapiens. And so as a result, we just veer away from it. We really, the sense of everything being a great house of cards that's going to collapse around us if we investigate too far, it gets all of us to look away. We don't really want to grapple with it. The other part of that Kierkegaard quote that I thought was important to cite, you might know from Robert Kennedy's speech after the death of Martin Luther King Jr., when he cited the Agamemnon, and he said, "Drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain." That he does the full quote from the Orestes, and he talks about the way that one of the ways that we learn wisdom is through agony, and it often works on us in our sleep. It's like a divine thing, that there is a way to crack through this envelope and bring us wisdom, whether we like it or not. And the harder we fight against wisdom, the more pain it takes before we can be enlightened about it. But as you say, Sharon, there is this phenomena that we see where even people who are suffering will turn away from wisdom, even when they have all the ingredients they need, someone else would think. They still won't do it. And that's how you know you're in the presence of an enormous force in human character. I mean, if we saw something this powerful in chemistry or physics, we wouldn't hesitate to say we're in the presence of a natural law, and we need to start investigating it and formulating models of it to understand, where does this mighty force come from, that these two things repel each other or attract each other or whatever thing we're seeing. But when it comes to human beings, over and over, we see this mighty force at work and we turn away. And that tells us there's another mighty force at work.
Yes.
and that's because, modernity has too much at stake for us to really investigate this problem. Too much would come apart. Douglas, you got your hand up. Come off mute and talk to us.
I just love the stories, fantastic stories that you hear from all of this thing, how they come up with the stories, I'll never know, but there's some of these stories are just fantastic.
Yes. Thank you, Douglas. That's right. That's, part of what's interesting about the Greek approach to storytelling and tragedy is that they were trying to make the invisible visible. They were trying to make the most important things that we need to know to understand the human condition. They were trying to make it visible for us by capturing it in the form of an unforgettable character who struggles with that very issue. Whether it's Midas or Oedipus or Agamemnon, they're trying to find people who can become, I need a more general word than virtuoso, who can become the paradigm for us, the example, such that, like Achilles said, he was willing to give up immortality to live a short life if it was a life of glory and prowess and heuristic virtues, because then he would have done the most important thing a human being can do, which is to supply a paradigm for future generations that they can learn from more easily than previous generations did. That was the height of Greek, the Greek desire for fame. That's what it was about. Even if, sadly, it meant becoming an object lesson like Midas, at least the object lesson now has a name, and you can remember this lesson by looking at this tragic example of what happened. So they were always on the hunt for potent stories, that just really summed up in a nutshell, in an unforgettable way, something that human beings desperately need to know. It puts you in mind of, there's a Shakespeare quote, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And we tend to read that as just being kind of despair or nihilism or what have you. But the really important part is not the life is part. It's a tale told by an idiot is a tale that is full of sound and fury, but doesn't signify anything. The signifying goes to the heart of what Achilles and Midas and Oedipus and all these characters are about. They're supposed to signify something. You're not supposed to be just holding out a finger and going, isn't this the best finger ever? You're supposed to be pointing at the moon. So someone can follow the finger and go, oh my God, it's the moon. This was the point of storytelling, was to connect those distant but important things to something that could signify for it. And that to be a story, it had to signify something. But if it was just a roller coaster that made you scared and then happy and then sad and then you laughed and then there was a romance at the end, if that's all there was and it didn't signify anything else, then to Shakespeare, that was a tale told by an idiot. And they're an idiot for these reasons we're talking about in this paragraph, because they're indulging in one or both of the primal psychological functions of the mind and not looking for the higher scale, the third function, that is the one that can connect the dots to make the critical and visible things visible to us. And that means the story is a waste of time, because it just took up time that could have been spent with a more powerful, more significant story that could have helped prepare future generations for the great challenge of life. Stephen, go ahead.
It's been, of course, you've met David Miller, who's been standing on the soapbox for a good part of the world's history since the 1950s. David Miller, who you spoke at one of our Aussie meetings, yeah. Now, he always makes this point with the humanists, and that they don't get the joke. These are the humanists. The humanists think that the whole cosmos is going to reflect their human values.
Yes.
And so David Miller's got this sort of rather obscure joke where he says, there's this race of alien beings called the lobster aliens, and they worship their god, Lobo, and they land on the earth, and the humanists are all running up. Oh, at last we've met the mind, the universal mind, which we all share, but these sophisticated aliens have probably overcome, our primitiveness. And the lobster aliens say, we have a god called Lobo who's told us you're our food. Thank you for presenting yourselves. We're now going to eat you. And this is the thing I notice with the humanists, so that they love the idea that the apes can talk or, create sentences. And I point out it's not that simple. I notice this particularly with the humanists, and they always seem to be rationalists, that the reason is some sort of magic elixir, which is so simple that once you drink of it, you'll never be thirsty again.
Right.
And I don't know, I'm not the smartest person on the earth, but I've looked at the way the mind works, and I've realised that what is in the universe and what is in the human instincts and what is in the human mind, there's a huge story here. And it's even worse that I'm reading, I'm at a first grade reader without realizing that the truth is an encyclopedia. But the humanists are beauties. They're falling for this one perpetually. That I'll put it simply, and this is rather rude, but the humanists, David Miller said this, the stench in our heads. They seem to think that the stench in our heads is a be all and end all. And I would put it in terms, they seem to think that the stench in their heads is the sweet smell of the cosmos.
Yes. Yes.
But it's a lot more complicated than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, you'll see this in Kenneth Smith. He'll talk about family scent and say the thing about an ideology is that the scent of the ideology, they are accustomed to it. And not just humanists, but any ideologue is accustomed to the way that everything smells after it has been translated into their ideology. But before it's translated into their ideology, it doesn't have that scent. So they think it stinks. It needs work. You have to go in and process it in order to give it the family scent that makes it our own. And what they don't understand is they have backwards which one is the sweet scent and which one is the, as funk musicians say, which one is the funk. The funk isn't in the things that we haven't molested yet in the world. The funk is in ourselves and the things we have molested to give them the funk. And we're backwards about where the truth is. It's natural that a modernist humanist would be an intellectual and would have the flaws you're describing, because all moderns have these flaws. Humanists make more of a point of reason and rationality. They believe that they can scapegoat the world's problems on that other function of the mind, emotionalism. They think that the cause of the Holocaust was rage and hatred and bigotry. They don't understand how much of the Holocaust was driven by cold calculation and following the rules and making things efficient. And science and progress were great drivers of the Holocaust. I mean, there have been people who wanted to kill people as long as there have been people, but the idea of saying we will now systematically, mechanically, industrially exterminate every example of a person, that requires reason and logic and intellect and science, massive education. It requires progress. It requires advancement. It requires modernity. Much of what makes the Holocaust is unfortunately the very things that an intellectual clings to as the source of all virtue and the salvation for all our problems. So it's a thing, but we can't do full justice to that right now. So we'll come back to that theme over time. Let's go back to the text. Second sentence, he says, human beings grow ensnared in their own idiosyncrasies and prejudices. In the order of what is their own, idea, right? This is where idiot comes from. From the order of what is their own, idiomata, they sink into a way of thinking circularly conditioned by what they have already taken for granted. That's that family scent thing. This persuades me because it has this family scent. It doesn't persuade me because it doesn't have the family scent. And they don't see that what they're really saying is it fits with the ideology I already have and therefore it must be true. Or it doesn't fit with the ideology I already have. In fact, it seems to conflict with it, so it must be false. And they don't realize the circular reasoning inherent in that. As if this were rigorously rational argument or stringently demonstrated evidence, right? So this is an expansion of the first sentence. This is where he's talking about, some of the mechanisms of this thing. How does it work? That it works on an emotional, experiential memory level, with that sense of what is familiar is good and what is unfamiliar is bad. Going back to Hegel's line about what is familiar is not recognized for what it is. But he's also getting into it on the intellectual side, the circular reasoning. That when you look at logic, although logic only promises validity, moderns read it as promising truth. They say, as long as you get your premises right, logic will deliver the truth. and we'll help you get your premises right. But when you dig into it, what you discover is the process of establishing the premises almost always involves circular reasoning. This is the functioning of what he's saying in the second clause of the second sentence. It's at the point where we establish the premises that we slip into place the circular arguments that will allow the logic to reach the conclusion we already know in advance we want it to reach, because our unconscious, with its awesome powers of gnosis, has already detected the pattern and felt whether this thing will fit or not, and what it has to do to it to make it fit, whether as a falsehood or as a truth, right? To do the sorting of the law of the excluded middle, gnosis as a servant of noesis detects the pattern, and then noesis lays out the premises, and then follows the rules of logic rigorously. And oh, what a coincidence, it leads to the conclusion that the person's unconscious had wanted to reach in the first place. But we blind ourselves to the circularity. And this is how we get into trouble. Okay, so let's do Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead.
So as I listen to you read those two sentences, and we're comparing it to moderns, I have to think about something that's happening now that we have in our media, and it's about the replacement theory.
Yes.
I had to look it up and saw that it was a concept that was first introduced in the 1940s. And you talk about circular and you get where you need to be. That's what this is. And so I was surprised to find that in the early 1940s, when we had the early European migration to the United States, replacement theory was prominent then because these Europeans were not white enough.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just the way us moderns think and the way we reason.
Yeah, yeah. If you scratch the surface of any modern ideology, you'll find very quickly there's circles. It's all circles all the way down. And it's only the power of our habits of thought and behavior that ensure that we never once turn our head to look at the circle. We always look straight ahead as we march in a circle. So it always seems like we're advancing forward and never noticing that the way that we walk draws us into the circle. And part of the challenge here is you can see it clearly with sort of really half-witted, stupid ideologies. And it can lead you to think that you don't do it because you don't do it that stupidly. You don't do it that nakedly. But in general, the sophistication of the ideology any person subscribes to is directly proportional to their intelligence. The smarter they are, the more complicated an ideology they'll put in place, because it has to be complicated enough that it gives them a way to not notice the circles. You know what I mean? If you're really dumb, you can have a perfect circle of an ideology and everybody but you can see it. But because you can't see it, you're satisfied with it. But if you're really smart, that simple circle would never satisfy you. You're like, oh no, that's circular argument. I can't believe that. I instead believe this thing, which is totally not a circle, even though it brought me right back to the same point I started in. This was something that I discovered in the 1990s in my own life. I was in therapy for 24 years, dealing with my troubled childhood. And my counselor was asking me how I felt, and I was talking about all this complicated, sophisticated theory stuff. And she says, well, that's all nice, but it's a lot of intellectual dust. I asked you how you felt and you didn't answer me once. And at the time I was hugely offended. I was like, this is some of my best thinking and you just called it intellectual dust. But what she meant was, it's distracting you from something that's right in front of you and important. And yet somehow with all that intelligence, you managed to fail to answer a simple question, which is, how are you feeling? So it's defeating you instead of helping you. It's become, the fact that it's sophisticated only means that you're intelligent. But sophisticated or not sophisticated, it's in your way. It's not the solution, it's the problem. And it reminds you of the man with the hammer. If a guy, when a little 4-year-old walks around with a hammer trying to hammer everything, you say, yep, that's the man with the hammer problem. But when you in your own life do incredibly more complicated versions of the man with the hammer, because they're more sophisticated, they're sophisticated enough that your own intelligence can't keep up with them. You can't see them. And so you think you aren't the man with the hammer, even though, well, it may not be a hammer, but you're certainly trying to use something else. All our ideologies work this way. And this is part of the nefariousness, the sneakiness of this liability to idiotism in us. We are all liable to idiotism. But if we can see obvious examples of simple idiotism around us, we can scapegoat those and say, I must not be engaging in idiotism because I don't do anything like that, thereby preventing us from looking at the more complicated, sophisticated idiotism that we are doing that escapes our notice. So this goes back to another Heraclitus quote. And he says, Homer failed to understand the lessons of the children, picking ticks off each other, lice off each other, when they said, what we grasp, we leave behind, but what we fail to grasp, we take away with us. The not noticing is the big driver in the structure of our lives. The nature of our labyrinth and our delusions and our idiotism will be determined by the reach of our grasp. If we have a short reach, then we'll fall prey to very obvious, stupid idiotisms. But if we have a great grasp and are incredibly smart, we will just build ourselves the best of all possible labyrinths for ourselves, big enough that we can't notice that we're doing it. Something that exceeds our reach. And then because we didn't grasp it, it's what encompasses us. Go ahead, Sharon.
Can I just add one thing for this? And this is a part of a fascination on my part. I think as human beings, we have two components. We have an intellectual component, which is what you were describing. So you're talking to the therapist and you're telling her all this intellectual stuff we have. But there's another life, or there's another entity within us that is called the passions. And those passions have intelligence. And I think recently more than recently, we've coined the term intellectual, emotional intelligence. But those passions undergird the intellectual choices that we make in ways that we do not acknowledge.
Right. The passions are a function of gnosis.
Yes.
And in modernity, we scapegoat gnosis as the source of all problems and pride ourselves on our ability to be logical and rational. And thereby, we ignore. I'll give you a tragic example. Survivors of serial killers often survive, as they say later, because they got the creeps. They're like, there was nothing wrong with what the person said. They might have been charming and witty and entertaining and everything else, but something made their skin crawl and they didn't know what it was. And they didn't know why they didn't want to be there and why they left. And later they were horrified to discover that if it hadn't been for that sense of the creeps, they'd be dead right now. That was what saved their life. That is not an anomaly. Those passions within us, those emotions within us, the part of what they're doing is they're putting together the picture in a way that we don't necessarily know how to express to try to get us to survive. And they can lead us astray. Of course they can. In the modern world, that's all we say they do. We say the emotions are the source of all problems and they get us in trouble. But the truth is they can save our lives and they can help to guide our thinking if we can develop them, beyond the naive state into something mature. So I think about that every time someone, reports the creeps in relationship with psychopaths. I think about what you're saying, Sharon, about the importance of drives within us, these passions, these emotions. They're not there by accident. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I want to address both what Sharon said and what Steve said, but in separate passages.
Yeah.
The white replacement theory, it really shows that as individuals and as cultural groups, we have a kind of convenient forgetfulness, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that, oh yes, that may indeed be what you're feared of, but wasn't the Indian replacement theory that you participated in? Oh, you just suddenly forgot because they were the others, and you know, and that wasn't you.
Right.
And it may be perfectly okay if you did it. And so that forgetfulness, the selective forgetfulness, is also an interesting part of our mind. Now, to get back to what Stephen said, I found his thing interesting, and in some ways it really relates to what I said about, the openness of the remaining open to the possibilities.
Yeah.
And I remember that, I guess part of our idiocy is because we don't want to be open. And part of the thing is maybe could be blame on language itself. I shouldn't say blame on language, because we don't understand it. Because what's important is like not only what is said, but what remains unsaid.
Yeah.
And I think most people don't realize that, oh, you didn't say this, he didn't say this. But I think that's the difference between, let's say, poetry and, let's say, logic. I think poetry understands there's always the unsaid part because it's an incomplete part that needs to remain open to the open, right?
Yeah.
I remember to address what Stephen said, because I think what he said about the lobster god was very interesting. I remember there was a Twilight Zone.
To serve man.
To serve man, yes.
Yes.
And it was really interesting because these, I guess, very intelligent beings came by in a spaceship and all that, and they left the book for everyone to see. It was in their language, and it was like, and of course, they're trying to figure out whether these were good guys or bad guys, and they finally cracked the code that it was to serve humanity.
Yes.
Sounds good, right?
Yeah, that's fabulous.
But they hadn't translated a subtitle yet. The unsaid part, and when so many people went on because there was a serve man and they go on the rocket. As when they were leaving, they finally cracked the code for the subtitle that it's a cookbook.
Yeah.
And they had totally misunderstood the part that was unsaid or untranslated at that time. So that was very interesting. And I think that's what that's happened to quite a lot of modern culture. Is like, we see the part that we think it is, and you think that's complete, but there's the other part that's unsaid, that's invisible, and you don't know that is the deep part, that it really is a cookbook. If you didn't know that, it is, oh, this is great. I mean, they're just here to serve my comfort, serve my needs. Like what's better than that? But if you knew it was a cookbook, no, that's not so good. So you have to look beneath that and see the subtext beneath it. Otherwise, I mean, if you just read it on the surface, then that's all there is.
Right.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Phil and Stephen, both. Yeah, those are great examples. And I think about flatland, and the metaphor of a sphere passing through the plane of flatland, and everybody thinks a circle just comes out of nowhere, and then it gets bigger for no reason, and then it gets smaller for no reason, and then it disappears, and that's how they describe what happened. And the idea that a sphere passed through their plane is literally inconceivable to them because it involves a dimension of the actual world that is not part of their experience of reality. They can't conceive of what's really happening, but they have a conception of their own instead of what's really happening. And they act as though that's the way the world works. But of course, it's never going to prepare them for things passing through the plane. It's because what's actually happening is unrelated to what they think is happening. It's a misrepresentation. That combination of the fact that you can completely misunderstand something while simultaneously being 100% sure that you understand it. This is almost the signature that you have something finite trying to represent something infinite, right? that we can't allow ourselves to admit how much is missing. So instead, we put unwarranted confidence in our models. So we think we've got it all figured out. And that very act of modeling it and declaring ourselves done is what prevents us from investigating further and discovering the existence of this hitherto unsuspected dimension of the world. So to be infinite in a living way and not in a trivial linear mechanical way is to be infinite in multiple dimensions at the same time in multiple different ways. And that's what makes it impossible to represent in any finite way. That's the thing that creates the mismatch. So, you look at this opening paragraph, and it seems like from a modernist perspective, he's just being a Debbie Downer. Right? He's just kicking our favorite beloved ideas all around and saying, nuh-uh. And so the natural initial reaction is, screw you, Kenneth Smith. How dare you say that we have these flaws in the way we see the world? How dare you say we've got this upside down understanding of reality? How dare you say we're wrong about all these things? Given the choice between re-examining everything in my life or just deciding that you're a poo-poo head, I'm going to decide you're a poo-poo head because it's easier. And it makes sense of things, right? From the perspective of modernity, which can't stand to be criticized. Someone who steps up and offers themselves as a critic of modernity, the obvious solution is, well, you're just a stupid person. You're just irritating for no reason. You're just a depressive personality who's trying to depress me too. You're just a negativist, right? And there are countries in the modern world that consider themselves modern countries that don't do this to the extent the United States do. But in the United States, we really expect every modern to be a cheerleader. I mean, we believe that being optimistic about our prospects is what makes it all go, right? The harder you cheer, the more your team wins. And if anybody gets in the way of that, they aren't just offering a contrary opinion, they are threatening your existence. They're going to make us lose through their negativity. And so it's why our solution to being confronted with things like the philosophy of Kenneth Smith is to caricature it as, oh, he's just one of those negative people who's trying to wreck everything. Because that's our go-to scapegoating solution when we deal with the grit and the Vaseline. Something doesn't fit, we say, well, you're the problem, go away. We couldn't be the problem, because look how well it's all working without you. You're the issue. But of course, that's not why Kenneth Smith is doing any of this. He's not actually saying, you all suck and you should give up and fail. That's not what he's saying at all. What he's saying is, if you are dealing with one problem that could possibly be addressed and dealt with, but you think you're dealing with a completely different problem that's a whole lot simpler, you got a whole truckload of trouble coming your way because you've got a massive mismatch between the scale of the thing you're trying to fix and the scale of the effort you're willing to give it. You are misrepresenting the problem you're trying to solve. And that's going to guarantee your failure, whether I say anything or not. That's what Kenneth Smith's argument is. If I say something, it offers you the opportunity, says Kenneth, to reevaluate the problem and see it in a more accurate light and change your strategies for dealing with it. Maybe we should go about things differently if we want to solve these problems. But as long as we pretend that the problem is much, much simpler than it actually is, we're basically setting ourselves up for failure. When we talked about the life cycle of epochs, how when they get to their pinnacle and their maximum power, one of the things they use it for is suppressing dissent, getting rid of the grit and the Vaseline, removing alternative perspectives, and thereby proving that they're right through their uniformity and their ubiquitousness. The more they can silence those dissenting voices on the side, the more it seems like everybody agrees. And if everybody agrees, this must really be working, right? But of course, in the process of doing that, what they're doing is shutting down the people who are seeing past the cultural envelope to the mismatches between the actual world and the real world as this culture imagines it. And by missing out on access to that information, they're setting themselves up for failure. They're becoming more brittle. when they become stronger, right? The purification is removing and suppressing the ability to detect what's actually going on. So this is kind of what's going on here, is he's trying to rupture the envelope and say there are different ways to look at this problem. And based on a lot of these perspectives, we're in some trouble. And if we want to deal with that trouble, we need to learn to look at the world differently than the way we've been looking at it, to see what it is we've been missing that's going on. Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, it's, this has been really interesting because, I was thinking about this idea, this level of sophistication, kind of commenting on what you had mentioned before, how we have this long convoluted way about thinking about things, and we realize that we've failed to understand the underlying problem that we're actually trying to solve in the first place. And I often think about this because it's in terms of I think that's just basic wisdom, which actually the Greeks wrote about quite a bit. And I think about some of the things that we've discussed in the past couple of weeks, specifically how it related to when we were discussing IQ a couple of weeks ago, right? So then what happens? You get this number, right, that tells you what you're capable of, right? Which actually does indicate something. It indicates something, but now it indicates everything.
Right.
So then what happens now? You try to create a master race, based on this number that you've kind of come up with. And you kind of start to see where that's an example of where we start to gravitate to thinking that we start to believe what we've created is the only way. And I'm seeing this true even in challenging some basic economic models that I've been reading about when it comes to things like income inequality, right? That there have been these models that people come up with that become a standard in the way we're going to actually manage society. And then this is the benchmark, and they don't necessarily include the whole system. They include a very small part of a system. They only include it's kind of complex. I don't want to go into a really long rant about it, but nonetheless, what I'm starting to see is this whole idea of being turned in on yourself on a higher level is this, and it all starts with this idea that we're starting to think we're wiser than we actually are. And I find it interesting because people that are often thought as these great intellectuals that lead us down a path, and they forget some basic human human principles, I would say, or even not even human principles, but basically just the idea of virtue itself gets lost in that process. And I think that's the interesting thing that I'm reading out of these few paragraphs here in section B, is this idea how we can start to believe our own hype and get turned in on ourselves, and how dangerous that really is. But yeah, it's coming together because you can start to see these, again, as I mentioned, some of these ideas of being sophisticated, how we start to say this is, and IQ is a perfect example. It, all of a sudden it changes your priorities as to what is good and what is bad, as opposed to actually reverting back to what's nature is, your interactions with everybody is what is good and what is bad, and not being, kind of separating yourself from that. And it's a systematized way of separating yourself from everybody else. So anyway,
sort it into little categories.
It is.
Nice and neat.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see. Anyway, those are my comments. Kind of long and
Thanks,
winded,
Joseph.
and sorry about that.
No, you're fine. It's good stuff. Yeah, every time the word abstract comes up, Kenneth wants us to think the word extract. To abstract is to extract from reality, and to extract in a way, in the way of the synecdoche, which is like a metaphor or simile, that takes the form where the piece you have abstracted now symbolically in your mind stands for the whole thing. And because it stands for it, through ceteris paribus, you now feel free to ignore the whole thing and just focus on the little piece you've abstracted. And this is one of the core functions of noesis. Noesis can't deal with the infinite. It's too complicated. Noesis wants finite things that will organize themselves into explicit linear relationships and nothing else, only those relationships. It needs a vacuum in which to work, like a toaster that if you leave it out in the rain, it decomposes. But a cat, you leave it in the rain, it doesn't decompose because it gets out of the rain. It goes and finds somewhere warm because it's an organism, not a machine. This typifies gnosis versus noesis. Noesis wants to create a vacuum of meaning in which it can abstract out the little facts that it has agreed to work with, to pretend that those represent reality, and to draw only explicit relationships between them, thereby arguing there are no other relationships that matter in reality. We can, through ceteris paribus, we can now feel free to play a background, foreground green and just suppress all of the messy details in which sadly might be found the meaning of life or the things that might allow us to succeed or fail. Instead, we're going to focus on this nice, clean, tidy, tied up with a bow, QED abstraction of the world. And to someone who has fallen in love with noesis, most moderns have to some extent, but some more than others. I was a hyper intellectual when I was younger. Man, did I pride myself on my intellect. And that got me in a host of trouble in school. But it took a while to learn that bit about noesis being a trap, that it defeats itself as much as it succeeds at things. And it defeats itself in ways that it itself isn't competent to see because of the very nature of noesis itself. It would have been easy to just obey the law of the excluded middle and turn into a hypergnosic and say, well, if noesis has these flaws, it must be bad, and that must mean that gnosis is good. Back to the trees, evolution was a mistake. But the thing is, the idea that neither of them is designed to be sufficient, even though each of them feels to itself as though it is sufficient. That idea, this is how you know with the Greeks, with Hegel, with Smith, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Arendt, and these others, you're dealing with some seriously sophisticated philosophy, because that is not an easy answer. All the easy answers, it says, are wrong on this. What's actually happening is complex, but the design, retroactively, the more we understand how Vernunft works, how it relates to Verstand and Begriff, you can start to see the wisdom of evolution in producing minds this way, because for all of its dangers and liabilities, it also offers opportunities that there really aren't any other way to get by pitting the two against each other. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Douglas, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Was interested in the first time machine. It reminds me when he goes into the future and he sees what happens to man, that they become like the Morlocks are taking over, or the cattle are taking over and eating the, eating the people. It reminds me of of that time machine thing. If you've seen the first movie and everything, when he goes and he checks it out and he sees what's going to happen at the end.
Yes, thank you, Douglas. That's right on the money. And I was talking about Banausoy and Duloy this weekend with a friend, and I think on Friday, and literally I was thinking of that time machine story, both the H.G. Wells original story and the movie, George Powell movie that was made from it. The idea of the Eloi, who are these beautiful, wonderful, friendly, kind people, except that they have no critical faculties to understand that their role is as livestock to be consumed by the Morlocks, who have the scientific, sophisticated civilization that makes it possible for the Eloi to live their worry-free lives. Wells is mining some fertile territory there. That's for sure. There's a lot of uncomfortable stuff there. But you're right, Douglas. It's directly relevant to what we're talking about. Both of these natural primal psychological functions and the characters that they generate in us and the kinds of cultures those characters generate in turn are half-witted solutions that have attractive features that can seduce us, but also have deeply problematic features that can horrify us if we can see it in the full perspective. And that's the thing that's interesting about this model of the human mind with gnosis and noesis, is that both of the two choices, if it were expressed according to the law of the excluded middle, in the binary way that moderns like to oversimplify things, both of the two choices are amazing and wonderful, and both of the two choices are horrific and disastrous. And they're those things at the same time, that the strengths and the weaknesses are the same things, but that can only be understood from the perspective of Vernunft. You have to get out of those two frameworks to look back on them, to see both their limitations and their beauties, to see how it all works together in the human mind. Sharon, go ahead.
So can I come back to the text?
I'd love it.
Because I think the second paragraph sums up very well what you're saying, with the lead sentence being the last paragraph, the last sentence of the first paragraph, where it says, the reason humans are cultural creatures who are captives of their own customs and words the world over. That's because of the primal psychology. And the second paragraph goes on to explain the myopia that we have from thinking the way we do. And I think Kenneth Smith says it very well here. The paragraph that starts, most human beings are never challenged in this tacit orthodoxy, not by the ethos of their culture or by other individuals. And that sentence, I think, is the predicament of the moderns.
Yes.
To those outside the envelope of a culture, whether it be the idea and the value system specific to a society, that's the IQ test, or to an organization or to a family, it is patent that those encapsulated in that culture are the victims of a warped field of consciousness, a system with massive blind spot implicitly defining what is unthinkable or incomprehensible.
Yes.
So I think that whole paragraph summarizes all the material that we've just discussed.
Yes. Yes, I think so too. You know, and his use of the concept of a warped field of consciousness, he's evoking gravity wells and black holes here.
Yes.
Right? Consciously, deliberately trying to give us a visual to see what it means when the cultural envelope is nested inside of a culture that does not contain any core functions for rupturing that envelope. Cultures can go either way. Cultures could be built in such a way as to create sacred spaces that thrive on rupturing the envelope in controlled ways to allow people to experience the subliminal or the inexpressible. You see this in shamanic cultures, right? The shaman goes where other people do not go in consciousness. You see this with the mystery religions of ancient Greece. The Eleusinian rites were a way to think about the cycles of life and death and understand one's place within them, to go past the simple answers and see that we are mortal, we are going to pass on, but it's okay. Not because we're going to live forever, but because it is the natural thing for all organisms to do, and that the succession of generations is where the real value comes from, not from any one individual. You know, I forget who it was who said it. There's some famous Greek who went through the Eleusinian mysteries and said, maybe it was Plato, who said, this is one of the most civilizing things about Greek culture. It's one of the most important things because it ruptures our ideas about the world in a safe way that allows us to bring the epiphanies back home and change our lives. So it's possible for cultures to be built in such a way that they harness this activity of rupturing the envelope and use it for the good of the culture. But in modernity, we definitely don't do that. We do the opposite. We suppress attempts to rupture the culture. It's one of the ways one of the things that's hard for Christian churches today is that they are fighting against an enormous modernist tide that wants to turn them into a form of escapism. Churches that use the experience of the divine to then turn around and say, it looks like we need to change the world, tend to run afoul of the law, and the IRS and any number of things. We don't, as moderns, want people having powerful epiphanies that rupture our preconceptions to then try to use that to change the world. Likewise, although I've never used them and I never plan to, hallucinogenics and theogenics drugs were used in many cultures to create exactly those kinds of experiences. They would be done not recreationally, but in a sacred space designed to help somebody break free of their standard preconceptions about the world, to see something, noumenal or liminal, and then bring it back into their everyday life and change it. We make those illegal. We absolutely do not want you to see outside the current cultural envelope. And if you do, we want you to shut up about it and keep quiet and keep it in your own home. So moderns in particular are subject to what you're describing. And what he's alluding to throughout this is that the Greeks saw this all around them in the world. Most cultures naturally try to strengthen their cultural envelope and not see outside of it. It's just that it has been more possible for there to be exceptions to that rule in the past than there is now. We're really working to eliminate any other perspective than the modern perspective.
Can I just say one thing? Because you mentioned the Christians, the evangelicals, because this next sentence is just awesome. He says, but the victims themselves believe their culture to be all embracing, infinitely competent to see what is the case and what is right and sane. And they absolutely believe what they're doing is right and sane, even though it violates all the laws of kindness and loving and patience, etc. Right? And then he says, all cultures, like all personalities, have an exclusionary character. And I miss that. Repelling whatever is distasteful to their core assumptions. All cultures void of controls to the contrary are states of narcosis. And that's what you were just talking about.
Yes. And if he says narcosis, which is about sleep, that's a Heraclitus quote. It is. He's talking about sleepwalking, right? This Heraclitus says that people get so preoccupied with their private intelligence about the world that they act like sleepwalkers, going through life not responding to the things they ought to respond to and responding instead to what they're dreaming about. This is core Heraclitus on epistemology and the human experience. So anytime you see in Kenneth even the faintest whiff of a reference to sleep, sleepwalking, narcosis, or so on, he's always quoting Heraclitus. It's never far from his mind here. So, when we did chapter 3, which had the brief introduction of the three epochs, we talked about the way that Christianity can't be equated with medievalism because medievalism is a particular form of Christianity. It is a genocidal orthodox form of Christianity based on the idea that their interpretation of Christianity is right. Every other form of Christianity should be exterminated. Convert or die, the sword or the cross, said Charlemagne. You either give up your version of Christianity and adopt ours, or you die. And that was not only acceptable, but was the road to power for the medieval church, around 800 when Charlemagne was crowned emperor. That approach, which a lot of fundamentalists buy into today, that they know what God wants. They speak for God, and they're going to enforce what God wants. That is in a struggle today against other forms of Christianity, which are ecumenical, which are based not on hubris, but on humility, on the idea that to recognize the existence of a God is to recognize our own finitude and folly and fallibleness. And that if we recognize our finitude, and we recognize, how different it would be for somebody to be superior, like the Christian form of God, that instead of making us arrogant should make us humble and should make us seekers after the truth instead of arrogant people who claim to have the truth. Instead of genocidal approaches to other religions, we should have inquiring approaches to other religions so that we can learn what they have learned about the divine that we will have missed because of our own finite limitations. And you can see a rise in ecumenicalism and humility-driven forms of Christianity side by side with these arrogant, angry, totalitarian forms of Christianity. So we're sort of a tug of war going on between the reactionaries who kind of want to go back to a medievalist approach, and I don't know what you call the other group, because some of them have their roots in the pre-medieval epoch, and some of what they're doing has developed, newly, and maybe it's a hint of the future, that exists in us right now. It's hard to say. So for anyone who's listening is wondering about my take on Christianity, it's that there are multiple forms of Christianity, so it's not appropriate for me to have one take on all of Christianity. The differences between these different forms is dramatic, and oversimplifying about them is like oversimplifying about anything else. Thanks for bringing that up, Sharon. That second paragraph, this is some juicy stuff right here. That the way that we resolve the struggle between the two basal faculties of the mind within us is usually by setting up a tacit orthodoxy in the cultural envelope to insulate ourselves from, through creating a warped field of consciousness to insulate ourselves from alternative perspectives. It's just such an easy, natural thing to do, that it's very common. And there are alternatives, but they're hard work and they're very uncomfortable, and they often threaten vested interests. Phil, go ahead, you got your hand up. I'm sorry, you're muted, and that was my fault because I clicked on what I thought was asked to mute, and instead I muted you.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad that Sharon brought us back to the text in the second, because I want to say something about the second paragraph, a different aspect of it.
Please.
But it allows me to go back to what Sensei Joseph was talking about. The specific quote I want to mention was, quote, "Everything is what it is in virtue of characteristic defining forces." Okay, so I mean it's internalized, and I was wondering about the ambiguity of that word, because there's the way he used it. There's two very different, seemingly contrary notions. Generally, we mean virtue as some kind of moral goodness. All right, whatever that means. And he says virtue is actually by virtue, which is in the way of defining character. So I'm thinking this way. The first thought I have is like, let's say a couple is out, in the woods, and one of them said, probably the woman who's more compassionate, says, "Oh dear, that wolf just killed the deer." Another homily, but nonetheless, it's a different homily. And the husband probably said, "Oh dear me, you don't understand. The wolf was actually virtuously, because he's acting by virtue of his character, right? He's a natural born killer." Right. Then I went to thinking, okay, if Kenneth Smith went by virtue of odd-defined character, then let's assume that I'm a mass murderer. They finally caught me. I'm in trial. And they say you are guilty of killing many people. And of course, I come up defending myself. It says, Your Honor, you got it all wrong. I'm actually a very virtuous person. You know that I'm a natural born killer. I have to act by virtue of my character. You are just being unjust by imposing your concept of virtue onto me. To which only the judge can only answer like, yes, you might be right. By virtue of our law, we are required to juice you up in the electric chair. Right? So you have a virtue, we have a virtue. Could you clarify that? Because it seems to me there might be some ambiguity there. Maybe the ambiguity is good. Maybe that ambiguity comes from the fact that human beings are so complex that that virtue of the character might be much more ambiguous for us to dig up by just claiming, by virtue of me being a natural born killer, I am a very virtuous person. I mean, because like the way he defined it, it does seem to be like, okay, unless the basic character of human being is directed toward compassion and, virtue of goodness, whatever we mean by that, then that could be ambiguous, because we could have natural born killers. We could have these very kind and gentle people, who are sheep that know that, the life is being whatever, I'm sure that farm animals, it was a good life. They're just that instant when, oh my gosh, I've been betrayed, I'm about to die. Right. So I mean, like,
it's a cookbook.
You're right.
To serve lamb.
Right. So it's confusing. I mean, it's like, I have to like equivocate and juxtapose. Well, how does that work out? Because unless human beings are just, no, that is not the virtuous person. There's no natural born killers. You are somehow deranged or something. And then it's hard to explain how that works.
Yes. So let's explore that just a little bit. So virtue and vice. Virtue and vice. So the Romans took this idea of virtue to mean whatever something's prominent qualities are its virtue. And that's what makes it possible to say, this guy's virtue is that he's a serial killer. That's that usage of the term. But the Greeks use the terms differently than that. And character and virtue are not as directly related. You would like to develop a character that has less vice and more virtue by the Greek model. And in that, it means that just because something is your character doesn't mean it's your virtue, right? So first of all, they drive a wedge right there. And then the second thing that they would do is say, bound up in that sentence is the idea that character not only is malleable, but is always changing, right? Your character is your inner nature. Nature is phusis. Phusis means flowing or becoming. Your character is in transformation. And to declare that what your character is at a particular moment is what it is intrinsically from birth is to, first of all, to claim to be dead, that you don't have a moving character. But second of all, it's to claim to be God, that you know the range of possibilities of your character so well that this is the best you could do and you're going to embrace it. All of that involves enormous amounts of hubris on the part of the serial killer, which does not come as a shock. I gotta say, based on the typical personality profiles of serial killers. But the idea here is that, and this is where we get into some stuff that we'll be talking about throughout this book, but I'll allude to it here because it's juicy. When Kenneth heard someone describing his philosophy of human characterology as implying that he was advocating a Brave New World type dystopia where people would be, decanted and cultivated to become a specific type of person to play a specific role in society. He said, first of all, if I've ever stood against anything in my life, I stood against that. This is the anti-Smith philosophy. But more importantly, there's a hubris in assuming that people are infinitely malleable. It is a modernist hubris, because the modernist orthodoxy up through the 60s was that people are a tabula rasa. You can make of them whatever you want. And the behaviorists were an extreme expression of that modernist belief. And we still have enormous amounts of behaviorist and other forms of modernist tabula rasa thinking all throughout our society. It's in our law code, it's in our economic system, it's in our political system, it's all over the place. There are still these assumptions of tabula rasa, even though now, 60 years later, we have plenty of evidence that there are parts of people's personalities that are not so malleable. There's a mix in us of the more malleable and the less malleable, just like there is in nature, right? Water is more malleable than rock, but water can erode rock and make it malleable. It can be done. It just takes longer. So this idea that the different parts within us are transforming at different rates, and it means that it can be harder for us to tell what is within our ability to mold or shape and what is not within our ability to mold and shape. And it also goes to the question of what our responsibilities are with regard to that. We don't know how much we could change somebody. And even within the realm of things that we think we could change in somebody, we don't know whether we should change them. How much is that our own vices, miscomprehending what we see and trying to noetically, Apollonianly, manipulate it to fit our system, rather than letting a healthy person emerge who might not fit well in the system and might insist we change our system. How would we deploy these powers? We would deploy them to try to suppress the individual, which is, a violation of nature, according to Kenneth Smith and the Greeks. So there's ethical, to call it a minefield is to flatland what's actually a multidimensional, very complicated set of questions about cultivating people. But what you certainly can do and have a responsibility to do is to try to create conditions for the raising of people that allow them to develop themselves in the healthiest directions available. And it has been much remarked upon that serial killers are not born, they're made. And they're usually made through extremely bad treatment. Most of them have gone through hideous trauma. Now, I don't know if they all did. Maybe somebody is by birth a serial killer. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. And this goes to Kenneth Smith's point. When it comes to human nature, nobody's an expert. We don't really know the full range of what's possible, and we don't know the full range of what we ought to do within the world of what's possible. But what we can say is, as long as we keep pretending that you're a tabula rasa, and that we have a duty and a right and a privilege and an obligation to mold you as we see fit, we're going to keep violating the rights of individual people to grow up into whatever it is nature might have had them grow into if we hadn't messed with them. It means we have a very complicated, thorny, perhaps the most complicated, thorny set of ethical and practical questions to which we don't have any clean answers. Kenneth Smith's contribution is not to tell us what to do. It's only to sketch in the shape of the problem better than we've sketched it so that we can revise our thinking and our approaches. And he leaves that part up to us because it was hard enough just to sketch in the shape of what's there when all of our language and thinking conspires against seeing it clearly, if that makes sense. So this takes us back to the question again, why doesn't Kenneth Smith tell us what we should do? The answer is he doesn't know what we should do. He's just trying to say what he's seeing. Anyway, great stuff, Phil. Thank you. And this isn't the last word. We're going to come back to this over and over and over throughout this book. It is just like talking about the relationship of human beings to nature is an inescapable topic from cover to cover in this book. In the same way, wrestling with the challenges of human nature and the ethical questions and pragmatic questions and everything else, that is also cover to cover throughout all of these columns. So what you just asked about, we're going to keep asking over and over as we go through this. Stephen, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, well, there's one for Phil there. That's to review all of Sir Kenneth Clarke's videos on YouTube or Daily Motion, wherever you can find them, because this is an art critic
Yes.
who was asked to comment upon history and other factors. When the BBC was looking for somebody to comment about the history of civilization, they chose an art critic. What frightens me at the moment is you just don't seem to see people like Kenneth Clark anymore, even, you know, Jacob Bronowski, who did the Ascent of Man. And this was the normal in the 1970s. To see somebody like that on TV, you took them for granted. 50 years later, you're just not seeing them anymore.
Right. Progress.
So
Progress.
there you are, Phil. Sir Kenneth Clark, give him a go, or, you know, Bronowski as well. You know, watch all those shows, those 70s shows. Not that 70s show, but those 70s shows. Anyway, very, very simply, I see the huge problem in modern culture, in modern politics, is the inability to grasp that you might not always get what you want.
Thank
But
God.
you know, the populace has come to the conclusion that they should all have the happy life. They're all going to be the Brady Bunch. That is my destiny. That's what I want. And what me want, me have, has been the battle cry of consumerism for the past 50 years or more.
Mm-hmm.
And they are being fooled. The masters of our world is Wall Street. It's not the Marxists. It's not the fascists. The masters are Wall Street, the people that are selling us stuff, the advertisers. It's like when I'll talk to a student, a tertiary student, I said, look, you might not succeed in your course. It's like they treat it as an object. When I get a piece of paper that says I'm a brain surgeon, I am a brain surgeon. And I said, well, no, the piece of paper is a qualification.
Mm-hmm.
That you might be good enough. What the academic course is there to teach you is what are your limitations? What are you good at? What are you bad at? And you have to keep on looking at that. But they think, oh, I'll just put on this hat. I'm a brain surgeon. I've done the course. Therefore, it's this strange tendency people have that if the whole world loves them, that's it. That's a pinnacle of existence.
Yeah.
If people say you're okay, we love you, we want you, that when you've reached that point, everything's okay. No, sorry, it doesn't work out. Look at Elvis Presley. So that's the big question. Me want, me get.
Mm-hmm.
This is so inoculated into modern culture that I must have what I think is going to make me happy, or as in Apocalypse Now when the general's trying to warn Marlowe. You've got to understand that good doesn't always triumph over evil. It doesn't always end like the fairy tale says. But you look, people are worse than ever in this regard. You go back 50 or 100 or 200 years, they were more aware. Today, we've blinded ourselves with advertising, with commerce, because they want to sell you something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right, Stephen. And it's a thermometer on the times and where we are in the development of modernity, because as the system purifies itself, it produces people that fit better and better inside of its orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy is, you know, through your wants, you shall be liberated. You know, go forth and want and consume, and a paradise shall surely follow, which of course flies in the face of what Heraclitus warned us when he said, it would not be better for men if they got exactly what they want. You know, right? He's telling us to beware of our desires. They lead us not to paradise, but to somewhere else that we would like a whole lot less. I know I'm quoting a lot of Heraclitus, but you can't hardly do Kenneth Smith without Heraclitus. And the same is true. There's a reason why I'm always bringing up Hegel and Kierkegaard and Kafka and the rest. They're all at arm's reach for him. I think I mentioned this once before, but it's worth saying again. Before Kenneth Smith writes a column, he sits down and goes through Bartlett's quotations and all of his other favorite collections of parables and paradigms and quotes. And he usually writes out a little document that just has the quotes and who said them. And he'll meditate upon that for a while and say, what are these themes that I'm trying to work with? And so there's a reason why his writing keeps circling around certain writers. And if you compare one of his books to another, you'll find there are certain characters like Kierkegaard are going to show up in all of them. But there's others who, will feature very prominently in one book, but won't in another. And that's because that writer was part of the collection that he built in preparation for writing that column, but not the other ones. So yes, what you're saying, Stephen, about want and to what extent are we slaves of our desires? That's Heraclitus, and of course it's all over this. Thank you. Douglas, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead, Douglas.
If I can get on, evil is inside ourselves. Okay, that's the thing that they're trying to bring out as much, that evil exists in us and and how we think and where we're coming from.
Yeah, that's a very Greek perspective for sure. That the whole art of writing a tragedy is the right of saying, not here is a diabolical, awful person and let's see what happens to them, but of saying, here is one of the best people you could imagine, and now let's see how their very best efforts lead to evil. We have to understand how it is a natural consequence of our actions. All right, let's go back to the text. I was going to move on to the third paragraph, but first I noticed this issue. I'm gonna drop this quote, this first sentence of the second paragraph again, just so we can focus on that for a moment. Most humans are never challenged in this tacit orthodoxy, not by the ethos of their culture, nor by other individuals. Sharon read this for us, and it's right on the money. But there's another issue about this. Most humans are never challenged, but most moderns take it a step further and believe they have a right not to be challenged. You could question people of other epochs about things they'd never been challenged about before, and they might be confused or upset or any number of emotional reactions, but they might go with you on the topic and look at it. Moderns are unique in the extent of our self-congratulation. To believe that we are the most objective, the most truth-seeking, the most accurate people who have ever lived requires believing that you're most of the way to the truth, right? With the way that we teach education is that you open up somebody's brain and you pour in knowledge and now they're educated. This is the metaphor that's used. All of the testing that's done in schools in the modern epoch, in most schools, is based on this model. You fill them full of facts and then that educates them. And now they're an educated person. And after age 18, that means they're an adult. Congratulations, we've arrived. And the idea that knowing things, learning things, becoming educated, becoming wise is that easy goes hand in hand with an extraordinarily low tolerance for the discovery that one is not wise, right? You call a medieval peasant a fool, and he's going to shrug and say, we're all fools, right? God is wise, we're all fools. Of course I'm a fool. Doesn't bug him. You talk to an Athenian about foolishness, and it's very easy to have a dialogue in which he'll admit, yeah, human beings are foolish, because it was a core tenet of their religion that, to be mortal is to be foolish. You look at the tarot cards that were systematized in the Renaissance, and the first of the major arcana, by the way, by a Christian sect. I think most people don't know that. The tarot cards were developed by a Christian group. the very first of the major arcana, number 0, is the Fool. And that's because the major arcana describe life's journey. And the journey always has to begin with where we actually are, which is, hello, Lord, what fools these mortals be, says Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream, right? We're fools. To be foolish is the normal human condition. And it's not an insult. It's not an attack to say that as a mortal, I'm a fool. That's the way it is. We're fools because we're idiots. We're idiots because we are parochial, which means that we interpret the world based on our own experience, one's own idiotia. To be idiotic is core to being a human being. It's just the way we start. And it is the way we develop. And we work life, if we are diligent, we work lifelong to reduce our folly. But we're never going to get rid of it because we're never going to become immortal and all-knowing. It's just not on the cards. To people of other epochs, that was not a problem. But to moderns, it sounds like a deadly insult, because we believe that we were born with certain inalienable rights, among which are the right to be the most objective, truth-seeking, honest people who ever lived. Now, he may not have put that in the Declaration of Independence, along with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but most moderns believe it is their inalienable right to be the most advanced civilization of all time. We are the knowers. We're the truthy people. And what it means, and then when we look around ourselves through in our modern world, and everywhere we look, our modernist worldview seems to be confirmed by everybody around us and the interpretation of the world that comes to us. It all seems to add up to justify, rationally justify the conclusion that we are mostly right and that nobody ought to challenge us, and if they do, they're wrong, or they're just one of those negative people. So as a result, this thing about most humans are never challenged in this tacit orthodoxy, what he doesn't do here, although I think he would agree, what Kenneth doesn't do here is underscore the point that moderns in particular not only are never challenged, but never want to be challenged and will never tolerate being challenged. We like the kind of challenges that are fun, that entertain an idea we hadn't considered before, but still fits within our interpretation, because that is a way of being surprised while also being patted on the head as we were mostly right. We like that. But what we don't like is to question something fundamental, because we have no practice with it. We have no experience with it. You see this in martial arts. You know, in martial arts practice, you drill the things that you want to do over and over and over and over and over again. It just like you do in music practice, learning how to play the notes. Just like you do in any serious discipline, you have to practice to get good at something. Well, we don't practice having our fundamental worldview challenged. So we're bad at it. And because, unlike the medieval epoch, we've become a world-spanning civilization, everywhere we go in the world, we seem to have our prejudice that we know what's what confirmed to us. So we're especially bad at being challenged in this orthodoxy. We're more trapped than most people ever have been, which is inconceivable to us, which is how the trap works. Because it's inconceivable to us, we don't try to get out of the trap. Speaking of circular arguments, here's one right here. It's the nature of our entrapment, our ensnarement, is that we don't have the faintest suspicion that we are trapped or ensnared. Life, liberty, 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 and the pursuit of happiness. We believe we're free by birth as God's gift to us. Therefore, it is an abomination to claim that we are ensnared, let alone that we are willing participants in creating that snare. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, this raises another problem, and I'll put it more somewhat personally, at least. I know that I'm flawed enough to not totally trust myself. As a consequence, I personally never really wanted the top position ever, because I'm afraid to make a mistake, and the mistake have consequences. And in a modern society, when those consequences could be magnified, then it becomes problematic. So I have reduced myself to a degree to only be in a position to do something that which I know that I'm really, really competent, way above my rank. So the mistakes are marginalized. Yet I know that so much of society is based on fake it until you make it, which is contrary. I mean, now part of my own action is based on a degree of selfishness, because the degree of responsibility I would take in taking any kind of leadership position is I would be devoted to that position rather than pursuing my own efforts to do whatever I need to do for myself, my own wisdom, edification, and so forth, and my own production. So this is not entirely just magnanimous, but partly also selfish, but that part is actually very much a part of it. So when you realize that the world is inhabited by incompetent fakers, then you're put in this sort of very funny position, like, damn, I could have done it better, right? Well, why didn't I do it? And it says, like, I mentioned before, I've advised my students, if you ever put in a position, whether you're going to be ranked 3 ranks above what you should be, or 3 ranks below what you should be, then take the lesser job, because you don't want to be the general and end up hiding in the closet all day.
Yeah.
Because everybody know that you're not a general, you're not even a colonel, you're not even a lieutenant colonel, you're actually at best a major, and so you're afraid of being asked a question, and everybody is saying, like, oh, you should ask the general that question, he's hiding in the closet. And this is a position I would never want to put myself into. So how do you work in a world when the mistakes are magnified, when the structure is such that it is very difficult for anybody of any degree of competence to actually rise to the level, and given the degree of autonomy, I'll not go to the degree of respect, but autonomy that you need to do to attract those people in order to do it, when all sorts of people who are motivated by self-interest and like fake it, faking it.
Yes.
And knowing that other people are faking it, so maybe you're not that far behind after all. So I don't know. That seems to be a problem that's structurally embedded in the culture itself.
This is making me think of the Peter Principle. That in any hierarchy, people rise to the level of their incompetence. But I think also, I had I work in a medical informatics community that developed the software for the Department of Veterans Affairs for their hospitals, and so I know a lot of those guys. One of them worked at the San Francisco VA hospital, and he was the head of the IRM department, which meant he had all the authority that pertained to computers, and that meant, among other things, he had all the sysadmin and programming level authority. He could go into any system, including the one being used by doctors and nurses during production time, and do anything. And that gave him the ability to fix any problem, but it gave him the ability to cause any problem as well. And it was from him that I learned a fascinating habit, which is a lot of people cherish having the privileges that give them more power.
Mm-hmm.
And he had that power, but he did the opposite. He set up his own user account to minimize the amount of authority the computer gave him to the bare minimum that would let him do his job. And that would let him do his job 90% of the time. Now, he retained the ability to take the cap off for emergencies, kind of the break glass, in case of fire maneuver. But the rest of the time, he didn't have the ability to go into programmer mode. He didn't have the ability to change the software they were running. He kept that turned off most of the time. And I asked him about that. I said, that's really striking because most people do the opposite. What they want more than anything is to have the best keys that give them access. And he said, yeah, but that's because they're fools. He says, I'm also a fool, but I know I'm a fool. I'm going to make mistakes. And the less power I have when I make the mistake, the less damage that mistake will cause. So I want my normal condition to be to have the minimum amount of power that lets me get by in the world. And I'll only up it in case of emergency. And then I'll know that I'm probably going to make bad problems happen in addition to fixing the problem that I'm trying to fix, because that's what happens when you have more power. It's like Nietzsche said, power makes stupid, right? You reach for the obvious brute force solution, even if it causes more problems than it solves, because it's so easy to do when you have power. The law of unintended consequences is magnified by the scale of the power that you're wielding. And I thought this should be like Phil Beza was his name. He was a dear friend. And I thought this should be the Phil Beza principle to counteract the Peter principle. And the Phil Beza principle is do your best to lower your level of power back down to your maximum level of competence. And keep the other stuff around only in case of emergency and use it sparingly. If that were a principle that was applied in the world more widely, we would have to reinvent all of our governments, our court systems, our economy, and everything else in order to comply with the Phil Beza principle. But if we did, there would be a whole lot less evil done in the world unthinkingly by people who are not paying attention to the consequences of their actions, because they wouldn't have so much power with which to magnify the consequences of their actions. It's when I think about what kind of better world would we want to try to cultivate, that's part of what I think about, is that Phil Beza principle of reducing the impact of our mistakes by reducing the power we wield. And you see that when you watch master craftsmen like carpenters at work, right? They could swing that hammer 10 times, 100 times harder than they usually swing it. They swing it just enough to move the nail and no more than that, because they know what happens. When you make a mistake, but you've got a wild swing, you're going to shatter something in a way you won't if you do a nice controlled swing. So they limit their power too. This isn't novel to Phil Beza. It's a general principle that just, I think, hasn't been named really before. Anyway, thanks, Phil. I'm going to call on Sharon, and then I'm going to take us back to the text. Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I'm going back to the text to follow up on what Phil just said, because I kind of have a very different view of it. But here's the sentence that Kenneth Smith writes. He says, "An all human mentality is potential delusion. For this same reason, nothing that is thought or believed is proof against the deformations that subjectivity can work on it." And so I heard Phil say that he would not promote himself up because he would be afraid to make a mistake. That was very interesting to me, because for my entire life, I live between life and death. That's on the edge, and making a mistake never crossed my mind. I just knew that I had achieved a level of competence, which would allow me to be successful most of the time. And the times when I'm not, I also had enough competence to bail myself out. Now, the comments of others, being a female in a male-dominated profession, I can tell you about that. Being a minority female in a white male-dominated profession is another issue.
Right.
But what you do is you grow a thick skin.
Right.
And you also, and what it does for you as a human being is tremendous. Because once I learned to survive, my level of confidence shot right through the roof. And before I knew it, I was the chief because of what they could see. So that's the other side of it. It's a
Mhm.
matter of taking the risk. And I respect, because if you take a risk, you can lose. The question is when you lose, what you're going to do. When I lose, I say, well, all right, how can I get out of this? How can I fix this? It's never oblivion.
Right.
It's cause for action. So it's just a different personality type, right? So was it a potential delusion? I don't know. I don't know. And that's my comment.
Well, you know, part of what medicine tries to do, that medical software also tries to do, is to create systems in which mistakes are expected and understood and have corrections.
Yes.
You know, it's part of making a fault tolerant system. There's a difference between a fault tolerant system and a fault proof system. People who try to make fault proof systems end up making systems that respond very badly when faults occur, which they will because we're mortal. But fault tolerant systems,
Tolerant.
they build in the recognition that we're all going to make mistakes, and they have systems for review and revision that allow the catching and correction of mistakes. And typically that goes hand in hand with controlling the amount of power being wielded at any given moment to be the appropriate level for that thing you're doing, so that the fault that's inevitably going to happen at some point also won't be too big, just a size that you can correct. And we try to minimize situations in which there's no going back. You know, and when those moments happen in medicine, there are often legal forms you have to stop and fill out. People often have to say, do you consent to this thing, which if it goes wrong could have a big mistake we couldn't necessarily roll back, because everybody has to be on the same page that this is one of those turning points. So there's an insistence on an awareness of the difference between a fault at a scale that can be rolled back and a fault at a scale that can't be rolled back. You know, they're sort of distinguished from each other. And that's because medicine is trying to be fault tolerant instead of fault proof. It's trying to be smart about the fact that we're all mortal and we're all going to make mistakes. And when you're in a fault tolerant system, it encourages the kind of confidence that Sharon's talking about, because you know the whole system has your back. It's training you to try to minimize the mistakes you're going to make, but it also has ways to catch and correct most mistakes and to recognize when you're approaching one that you can't roll back. Our problem is that as moderns, medicine is that kind of medical culture is an anomaly within modernist culture. Most of modernist culture doesn't work that way. Most of modernist culture is either fault proof, trying to be fault proof, or it's just fault denying. Right? There's a lot of resistance to acknowledging catastrophic mistakes in politics and economics in the modern world. We prefer not to talk about it, you know, and that reluctance to engage with our mistakes. I'm trying to remember what the name is, Sharon, for the morbidity and mortality. Is morbidity?
Yeah, there's morbidity and mortality, but the real action comes from the root cause analysis conferences that you have.
There it is. There it is. Yeah. Built into medical culture, that when things go wrong, you come together not to scapegoat somebody, but to study the system and how is it that this big fault that's uncorrectable got through. And then you look at your system and see if there's an opportunity to improve it so that won't happen to somebody else. Not just because they recognize that it's not just something that happened to the patient, it's something that happened to the practitioner who was failed by the system by not giving them a way to protect them against an irrevocable problem. But if you look at the way we do politics and economics, we absolutely don't do that. The last thing in the world that a politician or a rich person wants you to talk about is their catastrophic blunders, and they'll wield their lawyers to keep you from doing it, you know, or to punish you if you do. There is a huge resistance to creating a fault tolerant society, and instead we get a fault denying or you know, pseudo fault proof structure. So
one last question, one last comment that I have. I like that concept of fault and fault denying, because I was reading a speech that George Bush Jr. gave, and he kind of slipped up. I see Phil nodding his head, so he knows what I'm talking about. He kind of slipped up when he was talking about the current crisis in Iran, I'm slipping up too, in Ukraine, right? Because he saw the similarity based on what he did in Iraq.
Right.
And that was because of all these years as a culture, even though we skirted around what had happened, we never ever really came to terms with it.
Right, right.
And as a medic, that's a frustrating thing. That's part of my frustration with politics. And I look at some of the decisions that people make and I say, well, how do they get you to vote against your own interests? How does that happen?
Mm-hmm.
And is it that people don't understand? Is it that they got sold a bill of goods? Or is it the culture that we live in? And so it's always a question in my mind.
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of fault denial built into our culture from top to bottom, and it makes us brittle. And ultimately, it's one of the clearest signs that we're on the downslope, because, like we talked about before, when you are the upstart stage of your epoch, you cannot afford to ignore the elephant in the room that you're trying to overthrow. You can't, because they'll win. They'll step on you. The only way you rise to prominence is by doing a better job of paying attention to what's really going on, even if it makes you uncomfortable to talk about it, even if it's frustrating or difficult. You have to have your antennae out. You have to be in symathesis, in this learning relationship with the world. It is rising to the pinnacle of power that makes us egotistical and start to think we can cut ourselves off from that information. And when we do that, we become brittle. And then our mistakes start to impound us in ways that we refuse to look at, because to look at it would be to admit we made a mistake, which now we're allergic to doing. We don't want to admit it. And so this is how powerful systems take themselves apart. They disassemble themselves unwittingly. It's the paradoxes involved only look paradoxical when you look at the whole course. But if you look at any given one moment in an epoch, the screwy decisions seem to make the most sense. There's a reason why everybody makes those decisions that lead to the unwinding of the epoch. If you accept the premises, then you accept the conclusion. We got a little bit of time left. Let's work a little bit on paragraph 3. So the Greeks came to invent philosophy and science precisely because of their heightened sense of that universally human liability to believe what one already wants to believe. That is to say, the delusional potentiality of thought and culture, right? Their purpose was to try to create a fault-tolerant culture. And that was driven by the terror that they were going to repeat the disaster of the Trojan War. It drove them to want to do something different and uncomfortable, which is to cultivate the practice of critiquing, of doing, like Sharon was talking about, doing those after action reviews to figure out what just happened. Was this a bad idea, and do we need to change things? There's a stage in I think it's in Aristotle's Athenian Constitution. He's talking about the history of Athens, where the Athenians had such a corrupt oligarchy in charge that they decided to put a tyrant in charge. And the job of the tyrant was to clean up the mess that the corrupt oligarchy had made. It was to throw out the Constitution and make a new one that would not allow an equivalent oligarchy to arise again, right? That would make it so that the Athens was more proof against corruption. And he did. He gave them a new constitution, and then he stepped down. And they were able to carry on, with their revised constitution after that. It's a very curious thing to look at, because in most societies that could never work. Somebody had that kind of power, they wouldn't just use it to fix the Constitution and core laws and then step down. That just wouldn't happen. But Athens had reached a point where they were at each other's throats, and they had the example that they were all keenly aware of the Trojan War haunting them. And they're like, if we don't do something radical, we're just going to repeat on our small scale of a single polis what the entire Greek world did back in the Trojan War, and we can't let that happen. So they were willing to go further than most people would. They were doing a philosophical analysis of their own politics. And when they found it wanting, they violated the status quo. They basically stopped the status quo and reinvented themselves, and then carried on from the new point of reinvention. That was a core part of what the Greeks believed Aristoi were for. That Aristoi could get you out of a jam that Banausoi and Douloi couldn't get you out of. And they could do it because they weren't half-wits. They weren't just trying to make do with gnosis, and they weren't just trying to make do with noesis. That they were wielding not just Begriffe Verstand, but Vernunft, which allowed them to modulate between these two conflicting modes of thought and to find solutions that were not conceivable within the flatland of Douloi and Banausoi. And they understood that so keenly that they would do something as radical as threaten the vested interests of the most wealthy, most powerful people in Athens by stopping and restarting the whole government. It's inconceivable to us. I mean, that would not happen. What happens in our epoch is a tyrant gets in charge of a democracy and then turns it into some kind of horrific dystopia. Over and over and over in the modern world, someone reaches power and they're like, yes, finally, the thing I always wanted. And of course, if I wanted it, it must be good. And if it's good, I don't want to give it up. So my first step is to eliminate my opposition and make sure that I can remain president for life, like Franco, right? This is what modern tyrants do, because they're driven by completely different motivations. There is a diversity of motivations among Greek tyrants, which Aristotle writes about in his works on government, that is missing from the modern epoch. We only have the worst form. This alludes back to my earliest comments in today's seminar. So when he says they came to invent this precisely because of their heightened sense of this danger in human nature, the evidence is you can see them actually wielding it in their own documented history in ways we would never wield it. They believed things about the risks of human nature that we don't believe. And they believed it so strongly, they were willing to sacrifice literally on a financial level, the sacred level of moderns at which nothing must ever be challenged. They were willing to endanger money and power and authority and social position in order to wield philosophy as a corrective to what goes wrong in Dualic and Banausic societies. So this is one of the ways you know they are not a primitive version of us. They are not any version of us. That epoch has its own value system and its own worldview, which is not only different from ours, but is so different as to be just about blasphemous to us. It sounds like some kind of fantasy story when we read some of the things that they did. Sometimes it's terrible fantasies. They did some terrible things, but they did some audacious things as well that we would never do as moderns, because our value system is in direct opposition to that. All right, so then he says, they expected a life of constant struggle against the gravity traps of habituation. That is what philosophy provided. A relentless ethos of self-challenge and of audacity to dispute what was customarily taken for granted. In the modern bourgeois culture, what are the things you don't talk about? You don't talk about religion and politics, right? And in the 19th and 18th century, they added that. They say you don't talk about religion, politics, or money. You were not supposed to mention how much you made, how many savings you had, or anything. That was also off the table. But religion and politics has survived to the 20th, 21st centuries. We still say you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics. I was struck by a friend of mine some years ago from Italy, and she said, the weirdest thing about Americans is that for all that they congratulate themselves on their political system, they never actually talk with each other about politics. They shout at each other and tell each other how stupid they are for being in the wrong party, but that's about it. And within their own party, they may talk about politics sometimes, but sooner or later, it almost always devolves into, thank God we're not that other party, which is full of dum-dums. We're the smart party. And that about brings the discussion to an end. She says, you can't imagine how not normal that is. If you go to other places in the world, people always talk about politics, including with people they completely disagree with. That is a normal thing to do, to hang out with people from the other party and, you know, talk about life, the universe, and everything, and how you see the world and what are different kinds of solutions that you might settle on. So she said in Italy, every morning, people would go and they get their espresso. And while they're drinking espresso, you know, you have fascists and communists and Democrats and socialists and various other groups all sitting around chatting about how to solve the problems of the day, which you just don't see in America. That just doesn't happen here, ever. And that's because America is more modern. I was telling another philosophical group about that, and I mentioned that, you know, Americans are more modern, and they were offended because they thought modern was praise. They thought I was saying America was better. And I was saying, no, 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 modern isn't better. Modern is more modern, right? Modernity is an idiosyncratic, strange way of life. And we are more like that because of the melting pot, because we all left our previous cultures and came here, and the power that traditional cultures hold in the places where those traditional cultures arose is much greater than the power it has here, where we're sort of all, you know, I mean, am I German? Am I Norwegian? I don't even know what I am, right? I don't have any particular deep allegiance to the ways of my people. I'm a product of America. I'm very modern. I'm displaced. I don't have traditions. I'm uprooted. And most Americans, to some extent, are uprooted in a way that, you know, Italians aren't and can't comprehend. So this idea of how weird is it that the Greeks would just decide that they thought it was not only acceptable but good to challenge anything in a discussion. Everything was up for grabs, including politics, including religion, to a point. Socrates crossed that line, but, you know, to a point, you could challenge even religion. And you could certainly challenge religion if you were saying, you guys are missing some gods. There are whole collections of gods out there you don't know about, and you need to add them to your pantheon. You know, you say that to a Christian, and if they're ecumenical, you might get some forgiving stare. But if you say that to a fundamentalist, then fighting words, right? But among the Greeks, it was normal to say, I just came back from Ethiopia, and you wouldn't guess who they're worshiping. I think we are missing somebody. That would be a normal discussion to have in Sparta or Athens or Corinth or Thebes, in a way that it isn't normal for us. And if they would challenge the gods, they would certainly challenge their own constitutions, the rights of man, you know, what General so-and-so did the other day. It was all up for debate and discussion. It was philosophical discussion was expected as the normal form of conversation that, you know, adults should have with one another. You should be probing and questioning the things that matter. You shouldn't be cheerleading for the status quo. They considered that to be sub-adult behavior. They considered that to be the behavior of slaves, to just want to indulge in what you already think. It's like sucking your thumb and holding a blanket against your face. It's a kind of self-comfort that, you know, children might need, but adults were expected to have moved on beyond that. But that is our norm, to be wanting to congratulate ourselves on what we already think all the time. I'll break here for a sec, Douglas, and then Phil. Go ahead, Douglas.
I want to know how you, okay, because you're pretty knowledgeable, how you would put the situation we're in now, you know, with Ukraine and Taiwan, with the ancient Greeks. Okay, how would you look at it? I'm just trying to fantasize.
Boy, I'm sure not an expert on what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and I suspect nobody is. I think this is going to be one of those conflicts that decades and centuries from now, people are going to have really astute observations about why this all happened. And at the time, mostly what we have is, you know, if you're if you're in Russia, you get one set of propaganda, and if you're outside of Russia, you get a different set of propaganda. But mostly, none of us want to talk about the whole picture of how this came about. You can see, I mean, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago. One of the things that you can see is that the United States deliberately provoked this. We pretend to be appalled, but our government deliberately provoked this confrontation. And they knew they were doing it. And they don't really tell the rest of us that that's what they were doing. But it's just like when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, it was a surprise to many ordinary Americans, but it was not a surprise at all to Roosevelt and his administration, because they didn't think it would be that bad, but they provoked it on purpose. They were hemming in Japan. Japan wanted to expand to get natural resources. The US knew they wanted to do that, didn't want them to get more powerful than they were, and began sending in troop movements and ships to all the places where Japan was trying to expand, and basically kept them cramped, knowing that at some point they would retaliate and attack us, and believing that we could beat them if they did, and that would be better than if we just let them grow and then tried to fight them after they got big. So Pearl Harbor happened on purpose, but it took decades before most Americans knew that. And the same is going on with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. This is a deliberate provocation. What Putin is doing in Russia was foreseen and desired. We're hoping that we win this thing, but whether U.S. War planners are as clever as they think they are is, I guess, something we're going to find out. And that's a little scary because we don't have a really good history on this stuff for the last 70 years or so. Phil and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
To what degree you think the American political system developed the way it did by two very important factors. One is that they did not want to return back to a monarchy. I mean, many people thought that George Washington might have become king, but thanks to him, he was a smaller version of what you described. He declined because he didn't want to do that. He wanted to give democracy a chance. The other factor is that the United States, particularly at that time, was quite dispersed and diversified in terms of geography and types of cultures.
Yeah.
And due to that, it naturally and almost paradoxically developed into kind of a two-party system. I don't think it started that way. It was sort of like no parties.
Right.
But develop into a two-party system because when you have such a diversified population in terms of diversity of regions and diversity of ideas, then two is better than let's say a half a dozen, because you could consolidate power. And the problem with two is that then each party is very big and within it is very diversified. So therefore, within the parties, there's conflicts, right? Rather than if you were multi-party, let's say, then you would form a coalition government, and each one would be more pure. Let's put it that way, and that what would happen is they would remain somewhat stable, but they would coordinate with each other. As it is, then what happens is when each party is only two, that is diversified. You don't want to be caught as a independent because you have no choice in making, the policies, except for the vote. And then, but within that, what happened is that the diversity within each party begins to be flexible, and they move from one party to the other because they have different tensions within them. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder whether the two-party system, I mean, I've always sort of thought that was not the best system, but I wonder whether that was inevitable. And once it became a momentum, it became almost a tradition, right? That it was. So maybe that's why it's very different from, let's say, many of the European countries, and which is more well-defined, and they have like another unity, which is the culture within it. Now, the European Union is a whole nother matter what's together, but that would be the United States of Europe. And I think they're going to have even more difficulty than we have. So to what degree that is just a natural outbirth of the history, of, in a sense, restricting a kind of polarity in order to consolidate a system that worked, and it became conflictual within it. And every 50 years or so, it seems to almost flip around, or there's so much movement across. And some people have said, now we are at the moment when that is actually happening. Like people who might be traditional Democrats, some of them are moving to Republicans, some people who are Republicans are moving to Democrats, and so forth. And so therefore there's a lot of instability because of this shifting allegiance within parties. So I just thought I'd raise that question and see what you think.
Yeah, it's a telling question. It's an important question, and I'm going to decline to answer it because it's a whole can of worms, and we're down to our last 5 minutes. I don't think I can do justice to the scale of the question you've just asked.
Okay.
In 5 minutes, especially,
So you're avoiding the political questions that just as every American. Okay, fine.
I know, right? I saw. We'd have to actually set aside some time to talk about it and do justice to it. But this, I will say, it is not an accident that most other modern industrialized societies don't have a two-party system.
That's right.
And it's not an accident that we do.
Yeah.
U.S. history took a very different course than Australia or Italy or Germany or any of these other countries. And in that course, we have a much greater appetite for winners and losers. We want the winners to win utterly, and we want the losers to be utterly defeated. And that's easier to do with a two-party system than it is with a parliamentary system. Yeah. The great gnashing of teeth and pain of the defeated party in the US politics pleases the winners enough that they're willing to be the loser later in order to get in their kicks now. There's an enormous amount of pent-up anger and cruelty involved in winner takes all politics, the way we do it. And it probably has its roots in people's family cultures going back generations, and the way that we colonized this country and how we did it and how we felt about it. But anyway, yeah, we won't forget. There's going to be a whole stretch of chapters on modernism where we will have plenty of time to anatomize U.S. politics. So I'm going to call on Sharon and then Stephen, and then I think we'll wrap up.
So I just have a quick question, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm the only immigrant here. I'm not sure if Phil is. But one of the questions I have, do you think that a culture that's homogeneous maintains its core better than a culture that's diversified like ours? And when I say better, I mean the way we approach social issues, because in America, we don't talk about policy. Right now, I don't think we talk about policies when we're discussing politics. It's a culture war. It's a culture war.
Right.
So therefore, you wouldn't have a culture war in a homogeneous culture. You tend to avoid that. And I've been in homogeneous cultures. I've been to Iceland. I was recently in Germany, and in Berlin, I didn't see too many people looking like me. Everybody looked Aryan, right? and so I listened to a couple of lectures, and they talked mainly about the war, World War II, the gathering storm, and then the actual war. And it seemed to have been pretty easy to convince a almost homogeneous culture like that against the outsider, who was the Jew. And the Jew and the homosexuals and the gypsies against all the outsiders, because all those were part of the concentration camp. So I come back to the question I have: does a homogeneous culture maintain its core better than a diversified culture?
It has to do with how it's structured, right? Because you can structure your culture ecumenically, or you can structure it in a genocidal fashion. Either one works. If you do it in an ecumenical fashion, then the way that you interact with people who aren't from, your core homogenous group is through outreach and discussion. But the people who join your society become the ones who you can agree on core principles with, but they don't have to be like you in any other way as long as you've got the shared core. But the way a genocidal culture relates to outsiders is as threats that have to be repelled or eliminated. And it's so this to me, this is similar to the discussion about what all Christians are like. It's like, well, you have to acknowledge the massive distinction between ecumenical Christians and, genocidal totalitarian Christians. They're two different groups, even though they share the same ostensible label. The same is true of homogenous societies. There have been homogenous societies that welcomed outsiders, but welcomed them in a way that was that involved finding common shared ground. Now, what we do in the United States isn't either one. We don't have any shared ground. We're not about anything. People come here, and as long as they follow the laws, or at least don't end up in jail, they can do whatever they want. And so we present ourselves as the model of diversity, and by extension, ecumenicalism, as though this were the only way to do diversity and ecumenicalism. But I keep going back to the Greeks, for whom tribes were just how they began, but what they culminated in were cultures that were really excited about other religions and other cultures, rather than threatened by them. But they had them work together on the basis of shared principles. That was, to them, what made you a Greek, more than the color of your skin or even your gods. And it's part of why it's so fascinating to read these old Greek histories and myths, and you think you know them, and next thing you know, you turn a page in a version you haven't seen before, and it turns out that hero who you assumed was white was black. And the reason he's been black all this time and nobody mentioned it is the Greeks didn't care. The fact he came from Ethiopia, so what? He had the Greek virtues. That was all they cared about. He had the Greek value system. He could be, any from any tribe or group that they wanted. And this was something that the Romans prided themselves on, by the way, is what they were striving to create was an empire in which people got to keep their own religions and most of their own ways. There were only a certain number of things they had to do to fit themselves into the Roman Empire, but the rest of it they could keep to themselves. And it was seen as a good thing and a source of strength for the Romans. So I'm not saying we should follow any of these models. I'm just saying you can look at major examples of different ways in which a homogeneous core culture interacted with the diversity of cultures around it. There's a lot more than two choices here.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. And then Stephen, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I've been looking at this question. Are you aware of that YouTuber called TIK? Oh, he does World War II history, and he got a bit upset with the socialists, which is pretty odd, as he said, because he was a socialist as well, when he said, well, the Nazis were socialists. And he's created a storm. And then you look at what he said, and actually he's right. The Nazis were socialists of a different type. But I was just looking at the philosophy lectures of Arthur Holmes, was it? He did lectures on Hegel and all the broad philosophers. And he was pointing out that, say, the Italian fascists were the pure Hegelian outlook, the Prussian state. And somebody said something about Nazis, and he said, no, the Nazis and the fascists were poles apart. I find this a very intriguing statement, but I'm just wondering what he saw. But he said, you look at the manual for Italian fascism, it's just pure Hegelianism.
Is this the guy you're talking about? Arthur F. Holmes, died in 2011?
Yeah, that's him.
English philosopher, okay. So there's the link for those who want to follow up. I'm not sure which work you're talking about.
It's all on YouTube. They put his lectures on YouTube.
Okay.
On the various big name philosophers and that.
Yeah. Yeah, we could look at that. We could look at that. You know, that's the thing about these words is they're malleable. So this is one of the things Kenneth Smith always talks about. You know, it's to have a discussion like this, almost the first thing we have to do is start wrestling with, do these words say, do they make the distinctions we want to distinguish? And do they make the comparisons we want to compare? And certainly I've heard it expressed that Nazism was a structure that involved socialism for within the Nazi party and for those who agreed to abide by its guidance, but conquest for everybody else. So it was like it was a dual system. I've heard the US economy described the same way, as socialism for big corporations and capitalism for everybody else. And when you look at how the massive amount of money the US gives to corporations in this country, it's hard to refute. Many things require sort of a paradoxical description to get the full truth of them. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if Holmes was right that the Italian fascists and the German Nazis, you know, had enormous disagreements that they were very serious about. Certainly, the Japanese, you know, military imperialist fascism would have, you know, I know enough about that to know it had massive disagreements with both of the other two. So it's often the case that, you know, we can say something like Axis versus Allies as our abstraction for explaining World War II. And in so doing, we end up with a gross oversimplification of what was actually very complicated.
Well, Hitler wasn't a student of Hegel. He was a student of Schopenhauer.
Right.
Who was a student of Buddhism. And there's a link. Nazi Germany and the Japanese had a Buddhist element in them.
Let me see if I can find this reference. There's a book that was mentioned, I think, a year and a half ago. Might have been Richard Lamb, might have been somebody else. Zen Goes to War. Zen Goes to War, which explores the way in which Zen Buddhism was complicit in the rising militarism of Japan leading into World War II. And it was a great eye-opener for me because my only real experience with Zen Buddhism, which was extensive, was still narrow, was limited to how it is presented in martial arts today as a peace-oriented belief system. And the idea of major Zen thinkers and priests being some of the strongest advocates for military conquest was just, it blew my mind, right? So, and I would have thought.
I might add here, I have this Sri Lankan friend who's gone from Buddhism to Christianity, and he endlessly says that Buddhists are the most militaristic people in the world. You look at all the Buddhist countries, they're the ones that are so often involved in slaughters of, their minorities. And he keeps on saying this, and I just find it hard to believe, but I'm starting to wonder if he's right.
I don't think I'd go as far as he goes, but I would certainly say that to anyone like my earlier self who thought it was impossible for Buddhism to be pro-militarist, the book Zen Goes to War is an eye-opener, and so is the persecution of the Rohingya people in Burma going on right now. That's also driven by Buddhists. And again, it's mind-boggling. You wouldn't think, you'd think, what is it in Buddhism that makes them able to do this? It would seem to conflict. But then the same can be said about Christianity and its history of militarism. You look at the Crusades and countless other things, and you think, wasn't Jesus the Prince of Peace? Didn't he teach you to turn the other cheek? How are these massive armies mobilizing and going forth and conquering in the name of Jesus? And the answer is, well, religion is a much more complicated phenomenon than a bumper sticker slogan. You know, there's a lot more going on with each of these things. So, I know, Hitler had Jewish ancestry. He did a lot to promote Christianity in Germany and the Christian associations he created. we're very pro-Nazi, and we're trying to get people inculcated into Christianity plus Nazism as a formula. And as you point out, you've got the Schopenhauer influence with Buddhism influence on that. It's fair to say that a determined person can make anything they want out of whatever raw material comes to hand, even if it involves turning a philosophy completely inside out in order to justify the things that they want to do. And that goes to the paragraphs that we've read so far from section B here, which is this astonishing capacity the human mind has to reinterpret reality and nature, including its own nature and its own reality and behavior, to suit itself, to make an internally consistent picture that is nevertheless completely at odds with the actual world outside of that bubble. So next time we'll wrap up, we'll do the last couple sentences of this paragraph, and we'll move on to paragraph 4. We're making pretty good progress through section B. There's a good chance we'll finish section B next time, and maybe move on to section C the time after that. But I'm really enjoying this stuff. I hope you guys are too. I really enjoy talking about this with you and listening to you. It's one of the bright spots in my life. I was very sorry last Monday that I was too sleep deprived to be here, but yay. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, Steve, just a comment to you, Steve. So is that why Japan lost? Because they only have one hand on the samurai sword while the other hand is clapping? The other hand is one hand clapping, so you can't.
Funny, Phil. That's funny.
Too funny.
Who said they lost?
That's good. That's good. Get an A for that.
The only people the Japanese will lose to ultimately is themselves. They're their own worst enemies.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the
Okay.
human condition.
Yes.
On that note, let's wrap
Thank
up.
you.
Have a great week, everybody.